For 26 years, I believed I was adopted. Not found out later, adopted. Not surprise, you have a secret sibling, adopted. I mean, I grew up with it. It was baked into every school project, every awkward conversation at Thanksgiving. Every time a teacher asked us to bring in a baby photo, and my mom would say, with this practiced little smile, "We don't have baby pictures of Rachel. We got her when she was already 3 months old." I used to actually be kind of proud of it. It made me feel special, like I'd been chosen instead of just born. My parents, Grace and Robert Doyle, told me the story so many times growing up that I could recite it like a bedtime story. A private adoption, a young birth mother who couldn't keep me, a lawyer they knew through a friend of a friend. Closed records, no names, no way to ever find out more. And honestly, for most of my childhood, I didn't want to find out more. Grace and Robert were my parents. Full stop. I'm telling you this story because 2 years ago, I took a DNA test for what I thought was a completely harmless reason. I was newly pregnant with my first baby, and my OBGYN kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Family history of diabetes? Unknown. Genetic disorders on either side? Unknown. Any history of early heart disease, cancer, mental illness? Unknown, unknown, unknown. She finally just looked at me and said, "Rachel, for your daughter's sake, it might be worth doing one of those ancestry kits. Even a little information is better than none." So I ordered a kit. I spit in a tube, sealed it in a plastic bag, mailed it off, and forgot about it for 6 weeks. I want you to understand that when I did this, I expected exactly one outcome: a list of distant, nameless biological relatives I would never meet. Maybe a percentage breakdown of what countries my ancestors came from, and closure. A box checked. Something to hand to my daughter's pediatrician someday. What I did not expect was for that plastic tube to blow up 3 separate families, expose 2 affairs spanning almost 30 years, end my parents' 31-year marriage, and connect me to 2 half-siblings I never knew existed, one of whom found out about me the same ugly way I found out about him. A notification on his phone that said, "New close family match." I need to start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly how deep the lie went, and exactly how ordinary and happy my childhood actually felt while it was happening. I grew up in a mid-sized town outside Columbus, Ohio, in a beige split-level house with a swing set my dad built himself the summer before I turned 5. My mom, Grace, is sus, a elementary school music teacher, the kind of woman who cries at graduations that aren't even her own kids. My dad, Robert, sold industrial HVAC equipment and coached my rec league soccer team for 3 years, even though he openly admitted he didn't understand the offside rule. On paper, and in practice, they were good parents. Not perfect. My mom had a temper when the house got messy, and my dad worked too much some years. But good. Present. The kind of parents who showed up to every single choir concert and sat in the same 2 folding chairs every single time. The adoption story was just there. A fact of my life, like my blood type, or my last name. My mom used to tell it to me at bedtime when I was little, and she told it with so much warmth that I never once, in probably 15 years, questioned a single detail. "We wanted a baby so badly," she'd say, tucking the blanket up under my chin. And then, this wonderful woman decided she wanted better for her baby than she could give right then. And she picked us. Out of everyone, she picked us to raise her daughter. I used to ask, "What was her name?" "We don't know, sweetheart. It was a closed adoption. That means her information is sealed until you're an adult, and even then, only if she wants to be found too." Do I look like her? You look like exactly who you're supposed to look like. my mom would say, which even at 6 years old I noticed wasn't actually an answer. There were other things, small things, that I filed away without really examining. I have dark brown, almost black hair and warm olive skin. My mom is fair-skinned with light brown hair that's basically dishwater blonde in the summer. My dad is a redhead, or was, before he went gray, with the kind of skin that burns in 15 minutes flat. At family gatherings, when people would ask, "Oh, who does she take after?" my mom would just laugh and say, "Her birth family, obviously," like it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was treated that way. Nobody pushed. Nobody in my extended family ever, not once in 26 years, said anything that made me suspicious. Or so I thought at the time. I'll come back to that. I have a younger brother, Danny, who is my parents' biological son, born 4 years after they adopted me. Danny looks like a clone of my dad's side of the family. Red hair, freckles, easily sunburned, the whole package. Growing up, people would joke that Danny got all the Doyle genes and I got none of them, and everyone would laugh, including me, because why wouldn't we? It was funny. It was true. It made sense, because I wasn't a Doyle by blood. That was the whole story. I want to be really clear about something, because I think it matters for what comes later. I never felt like a second-class child in that house. My parents never favored Danny over me, never treated the adoption like a source of shame or distance. If anything, my mom overcorrected in the other direction. She was almost aggressively affectionate with me, like she was trying to prove something. I used to think it was just her personality. Now I understand it was guilt, but I didn't know that yet. By the time I was a teenager, the adoption was old news, boring even. I had bigger things going on. A boyfriend named Josh, who I met at 16 and, spoiler alert, ended up marrying at 24. Marching band, college applications. The adoption story sat quietly in the back of my mind, occasionally poked at by a stranger's comment, but never anything close to a real question. The first real crack didn't come until I was 22 years old, at my great-aunt Pat's 80th birthday party. And even then, I almost didn't notice it. Great-aunt Pat was my grandmother's older sister, which made her my great-aunt on my mom's side, meaning, in theory, she had absolutely zero biological connection to me since I was adopted. She was a sharp, funny, occasionally inappropriate woman who'd had 2 glasses of white wine by the time the cake came out, and she cornered me near the dessert table with a look on her face like she wanted to tell me a secret. "You've got Robert's eyes, you know," she said, studying my face the way old relatives do. "Every time I look at you, I think, well, there's Bobby's eyes, plain as day." I laughed it off. "I'm adopted, Aunt Pat. Remember?" She got this strange, flickering look. Not confusion, but something more like she'd caught herself. Right, of course," she said, and then she patted my arm and wandered off to find my grandmother. I didn't think about it again for almost 4 years. I actually forgot the conversation entirely until much, much later, when I was combing back through my whole childhood looking for clues, the way you do after your entire identity gets rearranged in one afternoon. That's the thing about the small cracks. You don't notice them until you already know where they lead. In hindsight, there were more of them than I ever registered at the time. My pediatrician once asking, with a strange pause, whether I had any known family history during a routine appointment when I was maybe 19, and my mom answering just a little too fast, "No, she's adopted. We don't have that information," before I'd even opened my mouth. A cousin's comment at a wedding about how wild it was that I had the exact same laugh as Uncle Robert, followed by a beat of silence at the table that I attributed to nothing at all. None of it registered as suspicious. It registered as adopted kid trivia. The kind of coincidental resemblance people love to point out because it's a fun thing to say, not because it means anything. I got married to Josh when I was 24, in a barn venue 40 minutes outside of Columbus, and my dad walked me down the aisle crying so hard he could barely get his vows to me out during the father-daughter dance. I remember thinking, watching him, that whatever biology said, this man was unquestionably my father in every way that mattered. I didn't need a DNA test to tell me that. I was sure of it. 2 years later, I was sure of almost nothing. Josh and I had been trying for a baby for about 8 months when I finally got the positive test, and I remember sitting on the bathroom floor of our little rental house just sobbing with happiness, the test shaking in my hand. We told our families that weekend at a cookout, and my mom cried, and my dad hugged Josh so hard he lifted him slightly off the ground, and it was, genuinely, one of the best days of my life. The complications started small. My OB flagged my blood pressure as borderline high at the 8-week appointment and wanted to keep an eye on it, especially since, again, we had no family history to reference on my side. At the 12-week appointment, she brought it up more directly. "I know this can feel like a strange thing to chase down," she said, "but even partial genetic information matters here. Preeclampsia risk, certain inherited conditions, blood clotting disorders. Some of this is testable, some of it isn't, but knowing your actual genetic background gives us a real head start instead of guessing." I told her about the closed adoption, the sealed records, the fact that I'd never had any way to find my biological family even if I'd wanted to. "There's another option now that didn't really exist when you were born," she said. "Consumer DNA testing. It's not going to give you medical records, but it can flag genetic markers for certain conditions, and it can sometimes connect you with biological relatives who've also tested, which might get you real family history secondhand. A lot of adoptees use it for exactly this reason." I left that appointment with a pamphlet and a strange fluttery feeling in my chest that I didn't examine too closely. That night, I told Josh I wanted to order a kit. "For the baby," I said. "Just for the medical stuff." "Are you sure that's all it's for?" he asked. And I remember getting a little defensive because of course that's all it was for. I wasn't some sad, secretly wounded adoptee who'd spent her whole life aching to find her real parents. I loved my parents. They were my real parents. This was just due diligence. A box to check. I ordered the kit online that night. It arrived 4 days later in a small white box with a cheerful logo on it, completely unaware, as I was, that it was about to detonate a version of my life that I'd trusted completely for 26 years. I want to walk you through exactly what I did, because I think about this part a lot now. How mundane it was, how little ceremony there was around something that ended up mattering so much. I did the swab in my bathroom on a Tuesday night while Josh watched a hockey game in the other room. I registered the kit online, answered a few basic health questions, checked a box that said I was open to being matched with biological relatives who had also tested, and mailed the little package at the post office near my work the next morning during my lunch break. I didn't tell my parents I'd done it. I'm still not entirely sure why. Some small, quiet part of me, a part I wouldn't have admitted to at the time, must have suspected that this wasn't something they'd be thrilled about. The website said results typically took 6 to 8 weeks. I forgot about it almost entirely, the way you forget about a package you ordered for a home project and then find 3 months later in the garage. Pregnancy took over my brain in the way pregnancy does. Nausea, appointments, nursery paint colors, a truly unreasonable number of hours spent looking at cribs online. My belly started to show. My mom took me maternity clothes shopping. My dad started, unprompted, converting the garage into a grandpa workshop for building furniture for the baby, the same way he'd built my swing set decades earlier. Everything felt, in a word, normal. good even. The best kind of ordinary. Then, on a Thursday evening in October, 7 weeks after I'd mailed the kit, I got an email notification on my phone while I was folding laundry. Your DNA results are ready. I remember exactly where I was standing. In the hallway outside our bedroom, laundry basket on my hip, one of Josh's socks still in my hand. I sat down right there on the floor of the hallway and pulled up the app. The first screen was exactly what I expected. An ethnicity breakdown. Mostly Western European, a smaller percentage of Eastern European, a sliver of something Mediterranean that I found sort of delightful, honestly, like discovering I was secretly a little bit interesting. I scrolled past that screen feeling pleasantly unbothered, expecting the next section, the DNA Relatives tab, to be a graveyard of fourth, sixth cousin matches with usernames instead of real names, the kind of distant, meaningless connections most adoptees get when nobody close to them has tested. Instead, at the very top of the list, above dozens of small, faded, distant matches, there was one name in bold with a relationship label next to it that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Robert Doyle, parent/child, 99.9% probability. I stared at it for what felt like a full minute without breathing. Robert Doyle was my father's name, my adoptive father's name, the man who was, according to every story I'd ever been told, not related to me by a single strand of DNA. I actually laughed out loud, sitting there on the hallway floor, because my first thought, genuinely, was that the test must have made a mistake, or that there was some other Robert Doyle in the database, some cosmic coincidence, and I almost closed the app right then and went back to folding laundry. But something made me tap on the match. It pulled up shared DNA statistics. Over 3,400 centimorgans shared, well within the range the app itself flagged as biologically consistent with a parent-child relationship. Not a coincidence, not a common name, not a glitch. I sat on that floor for probably 20 minutes without moving, the laundry basket still on my hip, Josh's sock still in my hand, running through every version of an explanation that didn't involve the obvious one. Maybe my dad had donated sperm decades ago and I was some kind of accidental clinic mix-up. Maybe there was a different Robert Doyle who happened to be a genetic match through some statistical fluke the app couldn't account for. Maybe, and this is the one my brain kept circling back to, refusing to let go. Maybe the story I'd been told my entire life simply wasn't true. I didn't say anything to Josh that night. I told him I had a headache and went to bed early, and I lay there next to him in the dark with my phone screen, brightness turned all the way down, staring at that name over and over. Robert Doyle, parent/child. I need to back up for a second and explain something about how these tests work, because it matters for understanding just how undeniable this was. A parent/child match on a consumer DNA test isn't a guess or a probability range the way a distant cousin match is. It's about as close to absolute certainty as the technology gets. You share roughly half your entire genome with a biological parent, a specific and enormous amount of shared DNA that essentially cannot be replicated by any other kind of relationship. First cousins share a small fraction of that. Half-siblings share about half of what a parent-child pair shares. There was no ambiguity here. There was no, maybe it's actually your uncle explanation. The app doesn't even bother giving you a percentage range for parent-child matches, because the range doesn't exist. It's binary. Either you share that DNA with someone, or you don't. I read 3 separate articles that night. At 11 p.m., lying next to my sleeping husband, Googling, "Can 23 and me be wrong about parent match?" and "false positive DNA parent test," like I was trying to talk myself down off a ledge. Every single result told me the same thing. This category of match essentially never produces false positives. If two accounts show up with a parent-child level of shared DNA, they are biologically parent and child. Which meant that my father, the man who had told me a bedtime story about a nameless birth mother for 26 years, who cried at my wedding, who was at that exact moment probably asleep 40 minutes away in the same beige split-level house I grew up in, was not just a stranger who happened to raise me. He was my actual, biological father, which meant the entire foundation of my identity, the adoption story, the sealed records, the birth mother who loved me enough to give me a better life, was, at minimum, not the full truth. And if my dad was my biological father, that opened up a question so much bigger and darker than, was I adopted? A question I lay awake turning over and over until almost 3 in the morning. If Robert Doyle was my biological father, who was my biological mother, and did my mom Grace, the woman who tucked me in every night with that same warm bedtime story, know the truth the entire time? I didn't sleep at all that night. By 6 a.m., I had made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for an explanation to come to me. I was going to drive to my parents' house that morning, before work, before I lost my nerve, and I was going to ask my father directly what that match meant. I had absolutely no idea, sitting in my car in their driveway with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, that I was about to pull a thread that would eventually unravel not just my own family, but 2 other families I'd never even heard of yet. My parents' house looked exactly the way it always did that morning. The same hanging flag by the front door, the same terracotta pots my mom filled with mums every October, the same dented mailbox my dad kept saying he'd replace, and never did. I sat in the driveway for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside, running through what I was going to say, and coming up with nothing that sounded right in my head. My dad answered the door in his robe, holding a mug of coffee, and his whole face lit up the way it always did when I stopped by unannounced. "Hey, kiddo, your mom's still... Everything okay? You look pale." "Can we sit down?" I said. Not a question. My voice came out steadier than I felt. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten approximately 10,000 breakfasts as a child, and I pulled out my phone and I put it down on the table between us, screen facing him, the match still open. "I did a DNA test," I said. "For the baby, for medical history." He glanced down at the screen, and I watched his face do something I will never, ever forget for the rest of my life. A kind of collapse, starting at his eyes and moving down through his jaw, like watching a building implode in slow motion. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't say, "Let me see that," or, "That's got to be a mistake." He just set his coffee mug down very carefully, like he was afraid his hand would shake too much to do it otherwise, and he said in a voice I barely recognized, "Rachel, I need you to let me get your mother." "Dad." My voice cracked. "Just tell me, please. Right now." He looked at me for a long moment, and then, and I think this is the moment I'll remember most clearly out of this entire nightmare, he started to cry. Not the happy, overwhelmed crying from my wedding. Real, ugly, frightened crying, the kind I had genuinely never seen from him in 26 years. "You're not adopted," he said. "I mean, you are, legally. The paperwork is real. But you're my daughter. My actual daughter. Biologically." "Then who's my mother?" I asked. "Because it's not Grace, right? That's what this means. That's what the test is telling me." He nodded once and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Her name is Diane," he said. "Diane Foster. It was a long time ago, Rachel. Before I really understood what I was doing. Before..." He stopped himself. "I need your mother to be here for this. Please. Give me 10 minutes. I sat alone at that kitchen table for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 15 minutes, listening to muffled, urgent voices upstairs, my mother's voice rising once into something sharp and frightened before dropping low again. When they finally came back down, my mom's eyes were red and swollen, and she wouldn't quite look directly at me, which honestly told me almost everything before she said a single word. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. My mother sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table exactly the way she did when she was about to deliver bad news to a room of 8-year-olds' parents at a school conference, and she told me a story that took almost 45 minutes to get through, because she kept stopping to cry, and because I kept stopping her to ask questions she clearly didn't want to answer. Here's what she told me, as close to word for word as I can remember it. She and my dad had been married for 2 years when he told her he'd had an affair. It had happened during a stretch when they were going through a rough patch. Money troubles, a miscarriage the year before that neither of them had really processed, long stretches of him traveling for work. He'd met a woman named Diane Foster at a conference in Cincinnati, and what he described to my mother at the time as a mistake, a one-time thing, had actually stretched on and off for almost a year before he finally ended it and came clean. The problem, the enormous, life-altering problem, was that by the time he confessed, Diane was already 6 months pregnant, and she had already told him the baby was his. I wanted to leave him, my mom said, staring at the table instead of at me. I packed a bag. I actually left for 11 days and stayed with my sister. And then he told me about the pregnancy, and Rachel, I don't know how to explain what that does to a person. It wasn't just an affair anymore. There was going to be a baby, a real baby, out there in the world, who was half your father, and I had a choice to make about what kind of life I wanted to have around that fact. Diane, according to my mom, hadn't wanted to raise the baby with Robert involved in a messy, complicated custody situation, and she also, this part came out much later, and much uglier than my mom made it sound that first day, hadn't wanted the baby publicly connected to her at all, for reasons that took weeks to fully surface. What my parents ultimately agreed to, after Diane made it clear she intended to place the baby for adoption regardless, was this. Instead of an anonymous adoption to strangers, Robert and Grace would adopt the baby themselves, quietly, through a private arrangement facilitated by a lawyer who did not ask too many questions and was paid, in part, specifically not to. I thought, my mom said, her voice barely above a whisper, that if I raised you myself, if I loved you the same as I would love any child, it would somehow make it not have happened. Like I could love the affair away. I know how insane that sounds now. I knew it was insane back then, too, if I'm honest. But your father begged me, and some sick part of me thought, if I say no, this baby goes to strangers, and your father spends the rest of his life wondering about her, and I never get to control any part of the story. If I say yes, I get to raise her. I get to make sure she's loved. I get to make sure nobody ever finds out, and it just becomes ours. A closed adoption story nobody could ever verify because it wasn't real in the first place. I remember sitting there, hand pressed flat against my very pregnant belly, feeling like the floor of the kitchen had actually tilted underneath me. You lied to me my entire life, I said. Every bedtime story. Every time I asked what she looked like. Every single time. I lied to protect you from feeling like a mistake, my mom said, and I remember being furious at how rehearsed that sentence sounded, like she'd practiced saying it in a mirror for 26 years in case this exact day ever came. I didn't need protecting from the truth, I said. I needed the truth. Neither of them had an answer for that. Nobody said anything for a long time. Once the initial shock started to settle, and I want to be honest, it never really settled. Not that day. Not for weeks. My brain shifted into this relentless, almost clinical mode of just needing every single fact. Like if I collected enough information, the whole thing would somehow make sense. "Does Diane know you told me?" I asked. "No," my dad said. "We haven't spoken to her in over 20 years, not since the adoption was finalized." "Does she know I exist?" "I mean, obviously she knows I exist. She gave birth to me. But does she know you and Mom raised me? Does she know my name?" "She knows we adopted a baby girl," my mom said carefully. "I don't know what she knows beyond that. Part of the agreement was distance. Complete distance, in both directions." "Did she want to keep me?" I asked. And this question, more than any other, made my dad start crying again. "I don't know," he said. "I've wondered that for 26 years and I don't know, Rachel." She said she didn't. I believed her because it was easier than the alternative. "Is she married? Does she have other kids?" My parents exchanged a look. A quick, loaded look that I clocked immediately, because I'd been watching people's faces for tells all morning. We heard, a long time ago, through a mutual contact from that conference, that she got married a few years after. My mom said slowly. "We don't know anything current. We made a point of not knowing." I sat with that information like a stone in my stomach. Somewhere out there was a woman named Diane Foster who had given birth to me, handed me to my biological father and his wife under an agreement built entirely on secrecy, and then gone on to build an entire second life. Possibly a husband, possibly other children, who had no idea any of this had ever happened. I left my parents' house that morning without eating breakfast, without finishing my coffee, without hugging either of them goodbye, which I don't think I'd done since I was a sullen 15-year-old. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I could make myself drive home, and I remember thinking, with a kind of dazed, disbelieving clarity, this is going to get so much worse before it gets better. I had absolutely no idea how right I was. I didn't go straight home. I drove to a park near our house and sat in the parking lot for almost an hour, trying to figure out how I was even going to say any of this out loud to another human being. When I finally walked through our front door, Josh took one look at my face and immediately turned off the TV. "What happened?" I told him everything, start to finish, and I watched him go through roughly the same stages I had. Disbelief, then a kind of stunned silence, then anger on my behalf that came out sharper than I expected. "They let you believe a lie for 26 years, he said. "A fake adoption story. They paid a lawyer to help them lie about it legally." "I know. And this Diane woman, she's just out there, living her life, not knowing you know any of this." "I know, Josh." He pulled me into a hug, and I remember just standing there in our living room, 7 months pregnant, sobbing into his shoulder, feeling like every certainty I'd ever had about my own life had been quietly replaced with a stranger's story sometime in the last 24 hours without my permission. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead yet. Confronting my parents had felt like the entire task, the whole mountain. But sitting there in my living room, I realized there was an obvious next step, one I couldn't unsee once I'd thought of it. The DNA testing app didn't just connect me to Robert Doyle. It had a whole relatives tab I hadn't even fully looked at yet because I'd been too consumed by the parent-child match to scroll further. I opened the app again that night, hands shaking slightly, and scrolled past my father's name to the rest of the list. There, about 6 matches down, below several distant cousins I didn't recognize, was a name I'd never seen before, flagged with a relationship estimate that made my stomach drop for the second time in 24 hours. Caleb Whitfield, close family, estimated half-sibling. I stared at that name for a long time. I had absolutely no idea who Caleb Whitfield was. But the app's algorithm was telling me, with real confidence, that whoever he was, we shared a parent. My first panicked assumption was that Caleb Whitfield was Diane's son, a half-sibling through my biological mother, meaning maybe she'd gone on to have another child with someone else after me. That theory held together for about 10 minutes, right up until I clicked on the shared DNA breakdown and cross-referenced it against what I now knew about my father's side. The app has a feature that lets you see which of your matches also match each other, and when I compared Caleb Whitfield's profile against my father, Robert Doyle's profile, they showed up connected too. Not as strongly as Robert and I were connected, but connected in a way clearly consistent with a parent-child relationship on that side as well. Caleb Whitfield was my father's son, not Diane's, some other woman's. I sat there on my couch at 11 p.m., 7 months pregnant, staring at a stranger's name on my phone screen, and I felt something shift in me. The shock from that morning curdling slowly into something colder and angrier. This wasn't a single, contained mistake my father had made 26 years ago and buried under a well-intentioned lie. This was a pattern. There was, apparently, at least one more secret child out there, born to at least one more woman, that my father had never told anyone about either. I didn't sleep again that night. Around 1 in the morning, I did something I probably shouldn't have done without thinking it through more carefully, but I was operating on almost no sleep and a level of anger I didn't fully have control over yet. I sent Caleb Whitfield a message through the app. I kept it short. I told him my name was Rachel, that the app had flagged us as likely half-siblings, that I'd recently discovered some unexpected information about my biological father, and that I would completely understand if he didn't want to respond, but that I would genuinely welcome the chance to talk if he was open to it. I closed the app, put my phone face down on the nightstand, and lay there in the dark next to my sleeping husband, absolutely certain I wouldn't hear anything back for days, if ever. He responded in 11 minutes. His message was longer than mine, and I could feel the shock radiating off the screen even through text. He explained that he was 29, that he lived just outside Dayton, about an hour and a half from me, and that he had grown up believing his mother's husband, a man named Mike Whitfield, was his biological father. He'd done the DNA test on a whim after a work friend gifted him one as a joke for his birthday, mostly expecting nothing more than an ethnicity breakdown and maybe a few distant cousins. Instead, he told me he'd gotten a parent/child 99.9% match with a man named Robert Doyle, a total stranger he had never once heard of in his entire life, 3 days before I messaged him. I honestly thought it was a mistake at first, he wrote. My mom's been weird and evasive every time I've tried to bring it up since. She keeps saying, "We'll talk about it later," and then finding reasons not to. I've been kind of spiraling, not knowing anything. This is the first real information I've gotten in 3 days. Who are you? Are you his other kid? Does he know about me? I told him yes. I was Robert's biological daughter, that I'd found out the exact same way. A shock parent-child match, just 1 day before he had. I told him about the adoption story, the affair with Diane, the lawyer, the entire 26-year cover-up my parents had constructed. I told him I had no idea, until his match popped up, that our father might have done this more than once. There was a long pause before his next message came through. I need to talk to my mom tonight, he wrote. She's known this whole time and never said anything. I have to go. Can we talk tomorrow? I don't really know what else to do right now. I told him, of course, and I gave him my number, and then I sat there in the dark of my bedroom, phone glowing against my face, thinking about a man named Robert Doyle who I had loved uncomplicatedly for 26 years, and how he had apparently fathered at least 2 secret children with at least 2 different women during his marriage to my mother, and lied about all of it, to all of us, for decades. I didn't fall asleep until almost 4 in the morning. When I woke up, there were 17 new messages waiting from Caleb, and the story they told was so much worse than I expected. Caleb called me the next morning instead of texting, and I could hear in his voice that he hadn't slept either. His mother, Sharon, had married Mike Whitfield when Caleb was 2 years old, and Caleb had grown up thinking Mike was his biological father the entire time. Mike's name was on the birth certificate. Mike had raised him, Mike had taught him to fish, and coached his little league team. The whole thing. There had never been an adoption talk in Caleb's childhood the way there had been in mine, because as far as anyone in his family had ever told him, there was nothing to explain. He was Mike Whitfield's son. Full stop. No asterisk. Except, according to what Sharon finally admitted to Caleb the night before, that had never actually been true. Sharon had been seeing my father, Robert, for almost 2 years before Caleb was born. An affair that had started, based on the timeline Caleb worked out with her that night, almost immediately after my father had ended things with Diane. Sharon had been a co-worker of his at a company he'd worked for briefly between HVAC sales jobs, and by her own account, she hadn't known at first that he was married. By the time she found out, she told Caleb, she was already in too deep to walk away cleanly, and by the time she got pregnant, walking away wasn't really an option she felt she had at all. Unlike Diane, Sharon had chosen to keep the baby and raise him herself. She'd been dating Mike Whitfield around the same time, an on-and-off relationship that predated the affair. And when she found out she was pregnant, she made a decision that she described to Caleb, almost 30 years later, in words that made him furious all over again, just repeating them to me. She said, "I decided the baby needed a dad who'd actually be there, and Mike was ready to step up, so I let him think the baby was his, and I never corrected it." She said it like she was explaining a smart financial decision, like she was proud of the logistics of it. Caleb told me Mike still, to this day, had no idea he wasn't Caleb's biological father. Sharon had never told him. As far as Mike Whitfield knew, 31 years into a happy marriage with 2 adult children, Caleb had a younger sister, Ashley, who I'll come back to. Caleb was his biological son. "She begged me not to tell him," Caleb said. "She said it would destroy their marriage for nothing, that it doesn't change anything, that Mike is my dad in every way that counts." She kept saying that phrase over and over, "in every way that counts," like it was supposed to make me feel better. I recognized that phrase immediately, because it was almost word for word what my own mother had said to me 24 hours earlier. "I lied to protect you from feeling like a mistake." 2 women, in 2 different states, who had never met each other, defending the exact same lie with the exact same language, as if there were some universal script mothers pulled from when they got caught protecting a secret this big. "Are you going to tell him?" I asked Caleb. "Mike, I mean." There was a long silence on the phone. "I don't know," he said finally. "I keep going back and forth. Part of me thinks he deserves to know the truth about his own life. Part of me thinks my mom's right, and telling him would just blow up something that's actually been good for 30 years, for absolutely no benefit to anyone. And then there's this other part of me that's just so angry that I almost want to tell him out of spite, which I know isn't a good reason to do anything this big." I didn't have an answer for him. I was, at that point, exactly 1 day further into this than he was, and I didn't have a good answer for my own situation either. Here's where things took a turn I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything else. 3 days after my first conversation with Caleb, he called me again, and I could tell immediately from his tone that something new had happened. "There's another one," he said. "Another sibling. She reached out to me this morning." Apparently, in the days after Caleb's own DNA results connected him to our father, his account had continued generating new match notifications as more relatives in the database updated their information, or as distant test takers got reprocessed through updated algorithms. Which is, from what I understand, a normal thing that happens with these tests over time, since the databases are always growing and refining. A woman named Melissa Ortiz had messaged him directly, explaining that she'd tested years earlier out of general curiosity, had a low-confidence, possible half-sibling flag on Caleb's profile that she'd never bothered investigating, and had only just followed up on it after noticing Caleb's own recent activity and a matching pattern of DNA overlap with a man named Robert Doyle that the system had recently reprocessed and flagged more confidently. Melissa was 31, 2 years older than Caleb and 5 years older than me, which meant, once we all sat with the timeline together, that she was very likely our father's first affair-born child, not his most recent one, predating even Diane's pregnancy with me by a couple of years. Melissa's mother, it turned out, was a woman named Patricia Cole, who my father had reportedly had a brief relationship with back before he'd even married my mother, a detail that, if true, meant Robert Doyle had a documented pattern of secretly fathering children with women outside his committed relationships that stretched back to before his marriage even began. Not a single midlife mistake he'd made once and buried, but something closer to a lifelong habit. Melissa had grown up knowing, unlike Caleb, that her biological father wasn't the man who raised her. Her mother had remarried when she was 4, and her stepfather had legally adopted her at 8. And she'd always been told, in general terms, that her biological father was someone your mother dated a long time ago who wasn't ready to be a parent. She'd never had a name. She'd never had any interest, she told Caleb, in finding out more, until curiosity got the better of her one slow weekend, and she finally clicked through the low-confidence match sitting untouched in her account for 3 years. Now, there were 3 of us. Me, Caleb, and Melissa, spread across 3 different families, none of whom had known the others existed until a series of DNA notifications started arriving within days of each other, like dominoes falling in slow motion. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was my father, Robert Doyle, 61 years old, who had apparently spent the better part of 4 decades fathering secret children across at least 3 different relationships and had never told a single living soul the full scope of what he'd done. Not my mother, not Diane, not Sharon, not Patricia, and certainly not any of us. Caleb, Melissa, and I started a group text within about a week of all connecting, and I want to try to describe what that felt like, because I don't think I have ever experienced anything quite like it before or since. Here were 3 adults, strangers to each other, who shared half of our DNA and absolutely nothing else. Different states, different upbringings, different levels of knowledge about our own origins, trying to compare notes on a man none of us had ever discussed with each other before, in an attempt to understand who he actually was. Melissa was, by far, the angriest of the 3 of us, and I understood why almost immediately once she explained her situation more fully. Her mother, Patricia, had never remarried after her relationship with my father ended, had raised Melissa largely on her own for the first 4 years before her stepfather came into the picture, and had struggled financially in ways that Melissa was now, as an adult, connecting directly to the fact that my father had never paid a cent of child support, never acknowledged paternity, and had, according to what Patricia eventually admitted once Melissa confronted her, actively denied being the father when Patricia first told him she was pregnant, forcing her to raise Melissa for years believing she might be genuinely unsure who the father even was, before a passing physical resemblance and a gut feeling led her, privately, to suspect the truth she'd never had confirmed until now. "He didn't just cheat and disappear," Melissa wrote in the group chat, in a message I don't think I'll ever forget. "He made my mom doubt her own memory of her own life for 30 years. And then he went and did the exact same thing to at least 2 more women after her. I want to know how many more of us there are. I genuinely don't think we've found the end of this." That last line sat in the group chat for a long time before anyone responded, because none of us wanted to say it out loud, but all 3 of us were thinking it. If our father had done this at least 3 times across roughly 3 decades, what were the actual odds that we were the only 3? Caleb was somewhere in the middle emotionally, furious at Sharon for the lie, furious at Robert for the pattern, but also strangely, quietly protective of Mike Whitfield's feelings in a way that Melissa and I both understood but didn't share, since neither of us had a Mike in our story. Someone innocent who'd built decades of love around a fact that wasn't true, and who stood to lose everything the moment it came out. I was somewhere else entirely. I was 7 months pregnant, watching my own parents' 31-year marriage visibly disintegrate in real time every time I saw them, and I was starting to understand that my own DNA test, the one I'd taken purely for medical history, purely for my daughter's sake, had become the trigger event for an entire cascade none of us could have predicted or stopped once it started. About 10 days after the first conversation in my parents' kitchen, I went back to my dad's house alone, without my mom there, because I needed to ask him directly about Caleb and Melissa, and I didn't think I could get honest answers with my mother in the room, watching him. He looked older than he had 10 days earlier. Genuinely, physically older. Grayer. Thinner. Like the last week and a half had eaten something out of him that wasn't coming back. "I know about Caleb," I said before he could even offer me coffee. "And I know about Melissa. And her mom, Patricia." He didn't try to deny it. I think by that point, some part of him had already accepted that the truth was going to keep surfacing no matter what he did, and he'd stopped bothering to fight it. "There were others before your mother even," he said quietly, sitting down heavily at the same kitchen table. "Before we were married. I was a different person back then, Rachel. I want you to understand that isn't an excuse, it's just, I don't even fully understand who that person was anymore. Looking back." "How many?" I asked. "Total. How many kids do you have out there that none of us know about?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him actually try to count in his head, which somehow made everything so much worse than if he'd just had a number ready. "I don't know for certain," he finally said. "There were relationships. Not all of them resulted in. I don't know if there are others. I genuinely don't know, and I understand how insane that sounds, that a person could not know how many children he might have out there. But I never wanted to know, Rachel. Every time it happened, I told myself it was the last time, that I'd never let it happen again, and then I just didn't ask questions when things got complicated. I paid for what needed paying for, quietly, and I moved on, and I told myself that made me responsible." "You didn't pay Patricia anything," I said. "Melissa told me. You denied you were even the father." He flinched at that. Actually flinched, like I'd hit him. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Before your mother. I was young and terrified, and I made a choice I'm not proud of." "You made the same choice with Sharon," I said. "And with Diane, you at least stayed involved enough to arrange an adoption, but you let Mom raise your affair child without ever telling me the truth for 26 years. There's no version of this where you were responsible, Dad. There's just a version where you got away with it for a really long time." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there is one. While all of this was happening with my father, my mother was unraveling in a completely different, quieter way that I almost didn't notice at first, because I was so consumed with the DNA revelations themselves. I found out, about 2 weeks in, that she had known, or at least strongly suspected, about Sharon and Caleb for years. Not the full details, not a name or a face, but she'd found receipts from a period my dad had claimed was a work trip that didn't match up with his actual travel records, back when Caleb would have been a baby, and she'd confronted my dad about it at the time. He'd denied everything, told her she was imagining things, and she, exhausted, with a toddler in me and a newborn Danny at home, had let it go rather than blow up the family a second time. I made a choice, after the first affair, to believe him when he told me it was over. She told me one night, when I finally sat down with her alone, without my dad in the house. And every time something didn't quite add up after that, I made the same choice again. I think some part of me always knew there might be more out there. I just couldn't let myself look directly at it, because I didn't know what I would do if I confirmed it. "You raised his affair baby," I said. "Me. For 26 years. Knowing, or at least suspecting, that there might be others out there he was hiding at the same time." "I loved you the second I held you," she said, and she was crying by this point. Really crying. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older and deeper than the last 2 weeks. "That part was never a lie, Rachel. I need you to know that. Whatever else was a lie, that part never was." I believed her about that part. I think I still do. But it didn't change the fact that she had built her entire adult identity around protecting a lie that wasn't just about me. It was about an entire pattern of behavior from my father that she'd chosen, again and again, not to look at directly, because looking at it directly would have meant her whole life had to change. About 3 weeks after my original DNA match, my mother told my father she wanted a divorce. 31 years of marriage over in a conversation that reportedly lasted less than 10 minutes. Once the divorce was in motion, I had to make a decision I'd been putting off for weeks. Whether or not to try to find and contact Diane Foster, my biological mother. Part of me didn't want to. I already had a mother. A complicated, currently divorcing, currently processing a lot mother. But my mother nonetheless. And some part of me worried that reaching out to Diane would feel like a betrayal. Or worse, like confirming some idea that Grace hadn't been enough all along. But a bigger part of me, the part that had spent 26 years without a single fact about my own origins, needed to know who this woman was. Not to replace anyone, just to know. Diane wasn't on the DNA testing app. She'd never taken the test, which meant she had no idea any of this had happened yet. But between my dad's hazy old details and a public record search, Josh helped me run one night. We found her. Diane Foster, now Diane Whitfield. No relation to Caleb's family, just a coincidence. An unrelated Whitfield through her current husband, living about 2 hours away, married for 18 years to a man named Frank, with 2 teenage children, a son named Tyler, 17, and a daughter named Ashley, 15. I sat with her name and her current life for almost a full week before I did anything with it. I found her on Facebook, a completely ordinary profile, photos of a lake house, a golden retriever, Christmas cards, her kids' soccer games. A whole life, built entirely without any awareness that 26 years earlier, she'd made a decision that was about to come knocking on her door in the form of a pregnant 26-year-old stranger who shared her DNA. I decided to write her a letter instead of messaging her online, because it felt like the kind of news that deserved more care than a Facebook message. I wrote 4 drafts before I settled on one, and I mailed it to the address the public records search turned up, with my phone number at the bottom and a single line that I rewrote more times than anything else in the entire letter. I'm not looking to disrupt your life. I only want to know the truth, if you're willing to share it. She called me 11 days later on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, and I had to step outside into the parking lot to take it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. "Rachel," she said, and just hearing my name in her voice did something strange to me, something I wasn't prepared for. "I got your letter. I've read it probably 15 times." We talked for almost 2 hours that first call, and I'm not going to try to reconstruct every minute of it, but I want to share the parts that mattered most. Diane told me she'd been 24 when she met my father at that conference in Cincinnati, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and that the affair had genuinely started as what she believed, at the time, was a real relationship. My father had told her, according to her account, that his marriage was already effectively over, that he and my mother were separated in every way but paperwork. She hadn't known, she swore to me, that this wasn't true, until she was already several months pregnant, and my father finally admitted my mother had no idea any of it was happening. "I felt like the floor dropped out from under me," she said. "I'd built this whole future in my head, and it turned out to be built on a lie he told me, not just a lie he was telling her." When she found out the truth, she said, she made the decision to place me for adoption almost immediately. Not because she didn't want me, she was very insistent on this point, repeating it several times in slightly different words like she needed me to actually hear it, but because she couldn't imagine raising a child who would forever tie her to a man who had lied to her so completely, and because your father, as she put it, made it clear he wanted the situation handled quietly and completely, which she took to mean he wanted her and me gone from his life entirely. "I asked for one thing," she said, her voice breaking for the first time in the call. "I asked that if he was going to have someone else raise you, it not be strangers. I couldn't stand the thought of you out there with no information about where you came from. He told me his wife had agreed to raise you herself. I want you to know that detail nearly broke me, Rachel. The idea that his actual wife was going to raise the child he made with me, while I got nothing, not even the right to ever ask about you. I agreed to it anyway, because it felt like the least bad option I had. I've wondered about you literally every single day for 26 years." I asked her the same question I'd asked my parents weeks earlier. Did she want to keep me? And this time, I finally got a different answer. "I wanted to keep you so badly it took me years to stop grieving it," she said. "But I was 24, unmarried, and the father of my baby had just proven to me, in the worst possible way, that he was capable of lying about anything to get what he wanted. I didn't trust myself to raise you well in that situation. I've regretted it and made peace with it in equal measure, more times than I can count, for 26 years. I want to be honest about something here, because it's the part of this story that still makes me feel the most guilt, even though logically I know I didn't cause any of it. I only uncovered it." Diane and I kept talking over the following weeks, slowly, carefully, both of us feeling our way through an entirely new kind of relationship neither of us had a template for. About a month into it, she told me she needed to tell her husband, Frank, the truth. Not because I'd asked her to, but because she said carrying the secret while actively building a relationship with me had become impossible to sustain quietly. Frank, it turned out, had known Diane had placed a baby for adoption in her early 20s, before they met. She'd told him that much early in their relationship, in general terms, without ever naming my father or explaining the affair angle. What he hadn't known, and what devastated him when Diane finally told him the full story, was that the father had been a married man Diane had believed was separated, that the adoption had actually been a private arrangement to keep the child within the biological father's own household, and that Diane had spent 18 years of their marriage carrying details about that relationship she had never fully shared with him. Frank didn't leave immediately. According to Diane, he went quiet for almost a week, sleeping in their guest room, barely speaking to her, before he finally told her what was actually bothering him most. Not the affair itself, since it predated their marriage entirely, but the fact that she'd chosen, for 18 years, to keep the full shape of the story from him, the same way my mother had chosen to keep the full shape of my origins from me, the same way Sharon had chosen to keep the truth from Mike. I started to realize somewhere around this point in the story, a pattern that went far beyond just my father's behavior. An entire ecosystem of people who loved each other and still chose, again and again, incomplete truths over full honesty, because full honesty felt too dangerous to risk. Frank and Diane are still married, as of the writing of this story, but Diane told me things have never quite gone back to what they were before. "There's a version of trust you only get to have once," she told me. "Once you've had to rebuild it, it's never quite the same shape again. Better in some ways, thinner in others." Tyler and Ashley, Diane's other kids, my half-siblings on my mother's side, which is a phrase I still have trouble saying out loud without feeling strange about it, found out about me roughly 2 months after Diane and I first spoke. Diane told them together, sitting them down the way you'd deliver news about a death in the family, and Ashley, the younger one, apparently cried for almost an hour, not out of anger, but because she said she'd always wanted an older sister and couldn't believe she'd had one her entire life without knowing it. Tyler took it harder in a different way, quieter, more withdrawn, needing weeks before he was ready to actually talk to me on the phone, working through what he later described to me as a strange kind of grief for a version of his family history he'd thought he understood completely. I met both of them in person about 4 months after everything started, at a coffee shop halfway between our two towns, and I remember standing in that parking lot outside, looking through the window at 2 teenagers I'd never met who shared my biological mother, feeling a kind of vertigo I don't think I'll ever fully be able to describe to someone who hasn't lived through something like this. While all of this was unfolding with Diane's family, Melissa was going through her own version of the same excavation with her mother, Patricia, and her situation turned out to be, in some ways, the ugliest of the 3. Patricia had never remarried after her relationship with my father ended, and Melissa's stepfather, the man who legally adopted her at 8, had passed away 6 years earlier, which meant there was no living man whose entire identity as a father was at risk of being upended, but there was decades of resentment that came pouring out once Melissa started asking direct questions. Patricia told Melissa that she'd been 22 when she got involved with my father, years before he married my mother, in a relationship she genuinely believed was heading toward marriage and a family, until she got pregnant and watched him disappear almost overnight. He'd denied paternity outright when she told him, according to Patricia, and had threatened, though this detail took Melissa several more conversations to get her mother to fully admit, to make her life difficult if she tried to pursue any kind of legal claim to child support, invoking family connections and a lawyer he knew who could make things complicated for a young single woman with no resources to fight back. "He got away with denying you for 30 years, Melissa told me on one of our calls, her voice shaking with an anger that had clearly been building for weeks. "My mom raised me on a receptionist's salary in a 1-bedroom apartment for the first 4 years of my life, because he decided it was easier to threaten her into silence than admit what he'd done. And then he went and did some version of the same thing to your mom, and to Sharon, like there was never going to be a consequence for any of it. I didn't have a defense for my father in any of these conversations, and I stopped trying to offer one somewhere around this point. Every new detail that surfaced made it clearer that Robert Doyle, the man who coached my rec league soccer team, who cried at my wedding, who built my swing set, had spent decades of his adult life making the same calculated choice over and over: get what he wanted, deny or minimize the consequences when they came due, and let other people absorb the actual cost. Caleb went back and forth for almost 2 months about whether to tell Mike Whitfield the truth, and I remembered genuinely not knowing, myself, what I would have done in his position. There was no clean answer. Telling Mike meant risking the destruction of a marriage that, whatever its origins, had by every account been a genuinely happy one for 31 years. Not telling him meant Mike would live out the rest of his life believing something that simply wasn't true, and it meant Sharon would carry the secret forever, the exact same way my own mother had carried hers, the exact same way Diane had carried hers before finally breaking under the weight of it. In the end, it wasn't Caleb who told Mike. It was Sharon, and according to Caleb, she did it almost entirely because she couldn't stand watching her son carry the secret alongside her anymore, watching him flinch every time Mike called him son, or brought up some childhood memory that Caleb now understood differently than he had a few months earlier. Mike's reaction, as Caleb described it to me, was quieter and sadder than either of them expected. Less explosive anger, more a kind of slow, grieving withdrawal. He didn't leave Sharon. He told her, according to Caleb, that he needed time to figure out what this actually changed for him, if anything, and that process took months, not days. What eventually helped, more than any conversation, was Caleb himself, sitting down with Mike directly and telling him, as plainly as he could, that none of the facts about his DNA changed a single thing about who had actually shown up for him his entire life. I told him, "You taught me to drive. You went to every single game. You walked me to the mailbox every single day after school until I was old enough to go alone, because I was scared of the neighbor's dog. None of that is less real because of who my biological father turned out to be. If anything, it's more real, because you didn't even know you had a choice about it. You just showed up anyway." Mike and Caleb are, by Caleb's account, closer now than they were before any of this happened, which is honestly the one piece of good news that came out of this entire ordeal. Mike and Sharon are still married. Ashley, Caleb's younger sister, his full biological sister through Sharon and Mike, unaffected by any of the DNA questions herself, took the news hardest of anyone in that particular family, mostly out of anger on Caleb's behalf, and it took her the longest of anyone to come around to speaking to their mother normally again. I haven't talked much yet about my own brother, Danny, my parents' biological son, and I think it's worth pausing here to talk about what all of this did to him, because I don't think people always consider what happens to the people standing slightly outside the direct blast radius of a secret like this. Danny was 22 when everything came out, 3 years younger than me, and he had grown up his entire life believing, the same as I had, that I was adopted and he was not. A fact that had never bothered either of us. That had simply been a neutral piece of trivia about our family. Finding out that I was, in fact, our father's biological daughter too, meaning we were full biological siblings the entire time, not half, not adoptive, but full was, in its own strange way, almost a happy discovery buried inside an otherwise devastating one. "I always kind of felt bad that people made such a big deal about you being adopted," Danny told me a few weeks after everything came out. "Like it made you somehow less related to the family than me, even though nobody ever actually treated you that way." Finding out we're full siblings honestly made me feel better about one thing, even though everything else about this is a nightmare. What hit Danny harder was watching our parents' marriage collapse and watching our father's reputation crumble in slow motion across 2 states as more of his history came to light. Danny had always idolized our dad in a way I hadn't quite realized until I watched him try to process this. The rec league coach, the guy who built furniture in the garage, the dad who showed up. Danny had to reconcile that version of our father with a man who had, by that point, at least 3 documented instances of fathering children outside his marriage and denying or hiding the consequences each time. I keep waiting to feel less angry at him, Danny told me about 6 months in, and it just isn't happening. If anything, it's getting worse, because every time I think we've found the full picture, something else turns up. That last part turned out to be more prophetic than either of us wanted it to be. About 7 months after my original DNA test, I had, by this point, given birth to my daughter Lily, a genuinely joyful event that felt strange to hold in the same period of my life as everything else that was happening. Caleb called me with news that made my stomach drop for what felt like the 10th time that year. A new match had appeared in his account. A woman named Renata, 42 years old, living in Michigan, flagged as a probable half-sibling. When we ran the comparison against our father's profile, the connection held up the exact same way it had with Melissa. Renata was, by our best estimate working backward from her age, our father's oldest known child, born when Robert Doyle was only 20, years before he'd even met my mother, the product of a relationship during his own college years that none of us, including apparently his own parents, had ever known about. Renata was cautious when Caleb first reached out, understandably so, given that by that point she'd landed in the middle of what was already, among the 3 of us, being referred to grimly as the situation. She eventually agreed to talk, and her story added one more data point to a pattern that was, by then, undeniable. A young woman, a pregnancy Robert Doyle chose not to acknowledge, a family raised without him, and decades of silence that only broke because a piece of consumer technology none of us had grown up with existed to break it. Renata declined to get more deeply involved with the rest of us beyond a few phone calls. She told Caleb she'd made peace with her own version of this story decades earlier and didn't feel she needed a new family at 42 years old, which I understood completely, even though it stung a little to hear. Not everyone processes a discovery like this the same way, and I've had to learn over the course of this whole ordeal that there's no universally correct response to finding out you have siblings you never knew about. Some people want in immediately. Some people need distance. Both are valid. As of now, we believe Renata is the 4th and, as far as any of us know, final sibling. But I want to be honest with you. None of us actually believe that with full confidence anymore. Once you've found 4, the number 4 stops feeling like an ending and starts feeling like a data point. I don't want to rush past the fact that in the middle of all of this, I actually had a baby. My daughter Lily was born on a Sunday morning in March, 6 weeks after my mother filed for divorce, and about a month after Frank found out the truth about Diane. And I remember lying in the hospital bed holding her for the first time, feeling this strange, layered kind of emotion that I don't think I've ever fully been able to explain to anyone who wasn't living through the same year I was. On one hand, it was the purest joy I had ever experienced. This tiny, perfect person who existed because of Josh and me, who had nothing to do with any of the lies or secrets tangled up in the rest of my family, who got to start her life with a completely clean slate. On the other hand, holding her made me think, more than anything else that whole year, about the sheer scale of what genetic honesty actually meant. I had ordered that DNA kit specifically for her, so that her doctors would have real information, so that she wouldn't grow up the way I had, with a "we don't know" answer to every family health question. And in getting her that information, I had ended up learning more about my own genetic risk factors than I ever expected, including, as it turned out, a family history of early onset heart disease on my father's side that neither Diane nor my mother had ever had reason to mention, since neither of them had it in their own families. My mom came to the hospital the day Lily was born, and my dad came 6 hours later, separately, because by that point they could no longer be in the same room together without it becoming unbearable for everyone else. Watching them take turns holding their granddaughter on the same day, hours apart, in a hospital room that had briefly become neutral territory in an otherwise fully collapsed family, is one of the strangest memories of my entire life. "She's beautiful," my dad said, holding Lily, tears running down his face the same way they had on my wedding day. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know I've said it and it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I mean it every single time I say it." I believe that he meant it. I want to be honest about that. I don't think my father is a cartoon villain, and I don't think believing he felt real remorse contradicts how angry I still was at him. Both things were true at the same time, which is a very strange, uncomfortable place to sit for as long as I had to sit there. My parents' divorce finalized about 10 months after my original DNA match, and by every account I heard, it was ugly in the specific, exhausting way that divorces get ugly when there's 31 years of shared history to divide up and reinterpret through a completely new lens. My mom's lawyer argued, essentially, that the entire marriage needed to be reassessed in light of a pattern of infidelity and deception that spanned its entire length, from before it even began through at least the birth of Melissa, potentially through Caleb's birth as well, depending on the exact timeline, which nobody could fully pin down given how carefully my father had hidden the details for decades. My dad's lawyer argued that ancient history shouldn't dictate the division of assets built jointly over 3 decades of an otherwise functioning marriage and partnership. They settled, eventually, in a way that neither of them seemed happy with, which I've come to understand is probably how most divorces actually end. My mom kept the house. My dad moved into a 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away, which he still lives in as of this writing. What struck me most, watching this unfold, was how much of the surrounding community had opinions about in a town like that. And by the time the divorce was finalized, my father had lost more than just his marriage. He'd lost a golf league he'd been part of for 15 years, when 2 of the other members quietly stopped inviting him. He'd lost his standing at the church he and my mother had attended together, where he now sat alone in the back pew on the rare occasions he still went at all. My mother, by contrast, found herself surrounded by an almost overwhelming amount of community support. Old friends, fellow teachers, even a few of my dad's own relatives who quietly reached out to tell her they were on her side. I want to be careful here, because I don't think public opinion is a good measure of moral truth, and I don't think my dad deserved to be publicly shamed by a town's collective gossip machine, any more than he deserved to escape consequences entirely. But I also can't pretend it didn't feel, at least a little, like some kind of overdue reckoning, watching a man who had spent decades quietly getting away with things finally experience some of the social cost that Diane, Sharon, and Patricia had each quietly absorbed alone for years while he moved on with his life, uninterrupted. I haven't talked much about how all of this affected my own marriage, and I think it's worth being honest about that too, because it wasn't nothing. Josh was endlessly patient with me for most of that year, but there were points, especially in the exhausted, sleep-deprived months right after Lily was born, while I was still processing new revelations about half-siblings and old affairs on a near-weekly basis, where I know I wasn't an easy person to be married to. I was distracted during conversations that had nothing to do with any of this. I snapped at him over small things that weren't actually about him at all. I spent hours some nights scrolling through the DNA app's relatives tab, half dreading and half hoping for a new notification, in a way that Josh, understandably, found difficult to watch me do to myself over and over. I feel like I'm losing you to a mystery that's never going to actually resolve, he told me one night, about 8 months in, after I'd spent nearly 2 hours on the phone with Melissa instead of coming to bed. I love that you found these people. I do. But I need you to also still be here, in this house, with me and Lily, and some nights I don't feel like you are. That conversation was a wake-up call I needed. I started setting actual boundaries. No DNA app after 9 p.m., no calls with Caleb or Melissa during Lily's bedtime routine, one designated night a week where I simply didn't discuss any of it with anyone, including myself. It helped. Josh and I are in a genuinely good place now, better than good, actually. In part because going through something this disorienting together forced us to get much better at communicating honestly with each other about what we each needed. Which is, I recognize now, the exact skill that every single adult in my biological family history had failed to develop. Generation after generation, leading directly to the mess I spent that entire year untangling. About a year after my original DNA match, on Lily's first birthday, I decided to do something that felt, at the time, either brilliant or completely insane, and I honestly still can't tell you which it turned out to be. I invited Caleb, Melissa, and their families to a small gathering at a park near my house, alongside my mom, my brother Danny, and Josh. I did not invite my father. I did not invite Diane, Sharon, Mike, or Patricia. I wanted, for one afternoon, to see what it felt like for just the siblings, the people who actually shared this strange, unwanted inheritance directly, to be in the same physical space together, without any of the parents whose choices had created us watching over the whole thing. Melissa almost didn't come. She told me later she sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to decide if she actually wanted this. A whole new set of family relationships she hadn't asked for, built entirely out of a man's mistakes, rather than any actual shared history. What finally got her out of the car, she said, was thinking about her own daughter, who was around Lily's age, and wanting her daughter to grow up with the option of knowing her cousins, even if Melissa herself was still figuring out how she felt about the rest of it. Caleb brought his girlfriend Priya, who I liked immediately, steady, warm, the kind of person who asks good follow-up questions instead of just nodding along. Danny came with a six-pack of good beer and immediately made everyone laugh by pointing out, within the first 5 minutes, that he was apparently the only normal sibling in the entire group. The only one who'd been born into the marriage he was supposed to be born into, without any complications at all. I remember standing near the picnic table at one point, watching Lily toddle around on the grass while Melissa's daughter chased after her, and Caleb and Danny argued cheerfully over whether the Bengals or the Browns were the more embarrassing Ohio football team, and I had this sudden, overwhelming feeling that's hard to fully put into words. All of this, every single one of these relationships in front of me, existed because of decisions that were, by almost any measure, deeply wrong. Affairs, lies, decades of secrecy. And yet the actual tangible result sitting in front of me on that blanket in the grass was a group of people who, whatever complicated feelings we all still carried, genuinely seemed to like each other. "This is so strange," Melissa said to me quietly, watching the same scene I was watching. "I spent 31 years as an only child, basically, and now I have this." "Is it a good strange or a bad strange?" I asked. She thought about it for a long moment. "I think it's just strange," she said. "I don't think I've figured out yet whether it's good or bad. Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other." I've thought about that answer more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire year. I want to talk honestly about where things stand with my dad, because I know some people reading this are going to want a cleaner ending than the one I actually have to offer. I still talk to my father. Not every week, the way I used to before all of this, but a few times a month. Usually short calls, sometimes a visit if Lily's involved, since he's still, undeniably, her grandfather. And I've made a decision, one I go back and forth on constantly, if I'm honest, not to let his failures as a husband and as an honest person entirely erase his role as a grandparent in Lily's life. At least not yet. Not while he's actively showing up and trying. He's in therapy now, which he wasn't before any of this. He's reached out, according to what he's told me, to at least try to make some kind of amends with Patricia, though she's declined to speak with him at all, which I think is entirely her right. He's paying Melissa, at this point, a lump sum that isn't nearly enough to make up for 30 years of unpaid support, but which he offered without her having to ask, and which she's told me she took mostly as a form of closure rather than because she needed the money at this point in her life. I don't know if my father is a fundamentally different person now than he was before all of this came out, or if he's simply a person experiencing consequences for the first time and performing the appropriate remorse that comes with finally getting caught. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count, and I genuinely don't have an answer. What I've settled on, for now, is that I don't need to have the answer in order to decide how much access he gets to my life and my daughter's life. I can love him, in the complicated, damaged way I still do, and also keep him at a careful, deliberate distance, and both of those things can be true without contradiction. My mom, by contrast, has had what I can only describe as an unexpected second act. She sold the house about 8 months after the divorce finalized and bought a smaller place closer to Danny, closer to me and Lily, in a neighborhood full of other divorced women roughly her age who she's become genuinely close with. She retired from teaching a year earlier than she'd originally planned, and she started taking painting classes at the community center, something she'd apparently wanted to do for decades and never made time for. I spent so many years managing a secret, she told me once, sitting in her new, smaller kitchen, that I think some part of me forgot I was allowed to just have a life that wasn't organized around protecting something. It's strange how much energy that takes, even when you're not thinking about it directly. I feel lighter now than I have in years, and I hate that it took losing my marriage to get here. She and Diane have, remarkably, spoken on the phone twice, a decision my mom made entirely on her own, without me suggesting it, because she said she needed to hear, directly from the woman whose baby she'd raised under false pretenses for over 2 decades, that Diane didn't hate her for the role she'd played in the whole arrangement. I wasn't part of those calls, and I don't know everything that was said, but my mom described them afterward as necessary and excruciating in equal measure, which honestly sums up a lot of this entire year for everyone involved. She and I are close again now, closer in some ways than we were before all of this, which I did not expect. There's a strange kind of intimacy that comes from watching someone finally tell you the entire truth about something enormous, even truth that hurts, even truth that changes how you see your whole childhood. I trust her more now, not less, which I recognize is a strange thing to say about the person who lied to me for 26 years, but I think I trust her precisely because I've now seen what she looks like on the other side of that lie, and what I've seen is someone who, however imperfectly, finally chose honesty when it mattered most, even though it cost her almost everything. Diane and Frank are still married, as I mentioned earlier, though Diane has been honest with me that the marriage looks different now than it did before Frank found out the full truth. They started couples counseling about 2 months after the initial revelation, and Diane told me it was, in her words, the hardest and most useful thing we've ever done together. Frank still struggles, occasionally, with moments of what Diane describes as delayed anger. a comment that surfaces out of nowhere weeks after they've supposedly moved past a conversation, a long silence after seeing a photo of me on Diane's phone. But he hasn't left. And by every account Diane gives me, he's genuinely trying to work through it rather than simply tolerating it. Ashley, Diane's younger daughter, has become, unexpectedly, the person in that family I talk to most. We text almost weekly now, mostly about nothing important. A show she's watching, a photo of Lily, complaints about a teacher she doesn't like. There's an ease to our relationship that surprised both of us. Maybe because Ashley was young enough when the truth came out that she didn't have to unlearn 26 years of a false story the way I did. She simply absorbed a new fact. I have an older half-sister, and adjusted to it the way teenagers adjust to most things, with more flexibility than any of the adults around her managed to show. Tyler took longer to warm up, but he came to Lily's first birthday party with the rest of the group and spent almost the entire afternoon talking to Danny about video games, which I took as a genuinely good sign. He told me, near the end of that day, that the hardest part for him wasn't really about me at all. It was realizing that his mother had an entire chapter of her life, an entire relationship, an entire loss, that he'd never known anything about, and having to rewrite his understanding of who his mom was as a young woman before she was just mom. "It's weird," he said. "You find out your mom is a whole person who existed before you, with a whole life you know nothing about. I don't think I'd ever really thought about that before this happened. I think that's true for almost everyone involved in this whole story, honestly. Parents becoming, for the first time, fully dimensional people with pasts, instead of just the roles we assigned them growing up. Caleb and Mike, as I mentioned earlier, are closer now than before, which remains the single unlikeliest good outcome to come out of any of this. Mike told Caleb, at some point during their long process of working through it, that he'd actually always had a vague, unexamined sense that something didn't quite add up about the early years of his relationship with Sharon. Some instinct he'd never chased down because he loved his family and didn't want to disturb it. Finding out the truth, paradoxically, gave him permission to stop unconsciously wondering, and to instead consciously choose, with full information, to remain exactly where he was. Sharon has had a harder road. Caleb told me she went through a period of real depression in the months after Mike found out, driven mostly by guilt rather than fear of losing her marriage. She kept saying she felt like she'd stolen 30 years from him, Caleb said. Like every good memory they'd built was now retroactively tainted for her, even though Mike kept telling her it wasn't for him. Sharon started her own individual therapy alongside the couple's counseling, and Caleb says she's doing better now, though he describes her as a quieter version of herself than she was before. Someone who seems to weigh her words more carefully than she used to, aware now of how much damage an unspoken truth can eventually do. Ashley Waugh, Caleb's full sister, not to be confused with Diane's daughter Ashley, which caused no small amount of confusion in our group texts until we started calling them Ashley W. and Ashley F. Took the longest to come back around to her mother, but she and Sharon have largely repaired their relationship over the past year. Ashley told me once that what finally helped her let go of some of the anger was watching Caleb build an actual, functioning relationship with Mike, despite everything. Proof that you could hold two seemingly contradictory truths at once, that a foundational lie had been told, and that real, unconditional love had also genuinely existed the whole time, underneath it and around it and in spite of it. Melissa's situation remains, in some ways, the least resolved of any of them, and I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend everyone got some version of a tidy ending, because that wouldn't be true. Patricia, her mother, has not spoken to my father, and based on everything Melissa has told me, has no intention of ever doing so. She declined the settlement he offered at first, out of what Melissa describes as pure principle, before eventually accepting a version of it. Not because she forgave anything, but because, as she put it to Melissa, he owes this. It isn't a gift. It's a debt. Finally being paid, decades late, and accepting a debt payment doesn't mean you have to forgive the person who owes it. Melissa herself has the most conflicted relationship with the whole situation out of any of the four of us siblings. She stays in touch with Caleb and me, and she's met Lily twice and clearly adores her, but she's told me more than once that she still isn't sure whether connecting with any of us was ultimately good for her. I spent 31 years not thinking about my biological father at all, she told me once. Now I think about him constantly, and I think about all of you, and honestly, some days I resent that this is even a part of my life now. I didn't ask for any of this. None of us did. I sometimes wonder if my mom's instinct, to just never look directly at the low-confidence match for 3 years, might have actually been the healthier choice, and I just wasn't strong enough to leave it alone. I don't think she's wrong to feel that way, even though I've personally landed somewhere different. I think there's a real, defensible argument that some truths cost more than they're worth to uncover, and I respect that Melissa is still actively wrestling with whether this was one of them, rather than pretending she's arrived at some neat, grateful conclusion the way a tidier version of this story might suggest she should have. I want to circle back to something I mentioned near the very beginning of this story, because it ended up mattering more than I expected. Remember Great Aunt Pat, the one who told me at 22 that I had Robert's eyes, at her 80th birthday party, and then quickly backpedaled when I reminded her I was adopted? About 6 months into all of this, I finally worked up the nerve to call her and ask directly what she'd known, or suspected, all those years. "Oh, honey," she said, sighing in a way that told me immediately I'd guessed correctly that there was more to say. "I never knew the details. Nobody did, except your parents, as far as I understand it. But I'll tell you the truth now, since everything's already out. I always thought it was strange, how quickly that adoption came together, and how nobody in the family ever got so much as a phone call about a lawyer or an agency or any of the normal paperwork mess everybody else I know who's adopted a baby had to go through. It just felt too smooth. And then you grew up looking exactly like Robert's mother did as a girl. I have photographs. Rachel, I could show you sometime. And I put it together in my own head a long time ago, but it wasn't my business to say anything. And honestly, I didn't want to be the one to blow up your family over a hunch I couldn't prove." I asked her if anyone else in the extended family had similar suspicions. "A few of us talked about it, over the years, quietly," she admitted. "Your grandmother, Robert's mother, I mean, God rest her? She went to her grave never saying a word to me about it directly, but I always got the sense she knew more than she let on to. Families protect their secrets in layers, honey. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes just because it's easier than the alternative." That conversation actually helped me more than almost anything else that happened that year, oddly enough. It confirmed something I'd started to suspect on my own, that this wasn't really a story about one man's secret, or even 3 men and women's secrets. It was a story about an entire extended network of people, some directly involved, some only ever suspecting from a distance, who had collectively decided, again and again, across decades, that a comfortable silence was safer than a difficult truth. My parents built the biggest, most direct version of that silence, but it existed in smaller versions all around them the whole time, in relatives who noticed things and said nothing, in a community that quietly accepted a story that didn't fully add up because questioning it would have been awkward. I've had a lot of time to think about all of this, probably more time than is entirely healthy, if I'm honest, and I want to share a few things I've come to believe, not as universal truths, but as the conclusions I've personally landed on after living through it. The first thing is that secrets don't actually protect the people they're meant to protect, nearly as well as the people keeping them believe they will. My mother told herself, for 26 years, that keeping the truth from me was an act of love, a way of shielding me from feeling like a mistake. What it actually did was deny me 26 years of accurate medical history, 26 years of understanding my own face in the mirror, 26 years of a relationship with my biological mother that could have started decades earlier under far less dramatic circumstances. The protection my mother thought she was offering me was mostly, I've come to believe, protection for herself and my father, dressed up in language about my own well-being. The second thing is that DNA testing has fundamentally changed what secrets like this are even capable of surviving. My father built his entire strategy: deny, minimize, compartmentalize, let the women involved absorb the consequences quietly, during an era when that strategy actually worked, when there was no real mechanism for four scattered, unconnected children to find each other within a matter of days. That mechanism exists now, and it is not going away. And I think about the sheer number of families who have discovered secrets like mine over just the past decade, purely because a plastic tube and a mail-in kit made previously impossible connections suddenly ordinary. The third thing, and this is the one I sit with the most, is that finding out the truth didn't actually ruin my life, even though it felt, for months, like it might. It rearranged my life. It cost me things. A version of my parents' marriage I'll never get back. A clean, simple relationship with my father. A childhood narrative I have to now hold with an asterisk attached. But it also gave me things I wouldn't trade back even if I could. Caleb, Melissa, a real relationship with Diane, a closer bond with my own mother built on actual honesty instead of a carefully managed performance of it, and, maybe most importantly, accurate genetic information for my daughter, which was the entire reason I ordered that kit in the first place. Since I first started talking about pieces of this story with close friends, and later, more publicly, there are a handful of questions I get asked constantly, and I want to answer a few of them directly here, because I think the answers matter. People ask if I regret taking the DNA test. I don't. Not once. Not even in the worst weeks of that first year. I understand why people ask. The sheer scale of what it uncovered makes it tempting to imagine a version of my life where I never took the test and everyone just stayed comfortably unaware. But that version of my life was built on a lie that was actively harming multiple people the entire time it stayed hidden, whether or not any of us knew it. I don't think ignorance was ever actually the peaceful option it might look like from the outside. It was just a quieter, slower kind of harm. People ask if I've forgiven my father. I usually tell them forgiveness isn't really the right framework for what I'm doing. I haven't decided he's absolved of what he did. I've decided, instead, to have a relationship with the person he is now, informed by, but not entirely defined by who he was before, while keeping clear boundaries around how much access he gets to my trust and to my daughter's life. That's not forgiveness in the traditional sense. It's something more like ongoing, cautious observation. People ask if I think there are more siblings out there. Honestly, yes. I don't have proof, but based on the pattern we've already confirmed, at least 4 children across 4 different relationships spanning nearly 40 years, I would be surprised if we've actually found everyone. I've made peace with the idea that my phone might buzz again someday with a new match notification, and that if it does, I'll deal with it the same way I dealt with the first one. Badly, at first. And then, eventually. Somehow. Okay. There's a practical thread to this story I haven't touched on yet, and it turned out to be more complicated than any of us expected. The actual legal status of my adoption. Once the truth came out, I started asking questions about the lawyer who had facilitated the whole arrangement, a man named Gerald Fenn, who had, according to my parents, handled private adoptions throughout that region for years and was, by the time any of this came out, long retired and, as it turned out, deceased. I hired an attorney myself, mostly out of curiosity about what the actual paper trail said, and what she found was unsettling in its own quiet way. The adoption paperwork was, on its face, entirely legitimate. Grace and Robert Doyle had legally adopted a baby girl, with real signatures, real court filings, real finalized decrees. What made it fraudulent wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the fact that the birth father listed on Diane's original relinquishment forms was marked as unknown, when in fact, he was one half of the adoptive couple standing right there in the room. My attorney told me this kind of arrangement, while ethically obviously troubling, wasn't actually as rare or as clearly illegal as I expected, especially decades ago, before DNA testing existed to catch it. Private, informal arrangements between a biological parent and an affair partner's spouse happened more often than most people realize, she said, precisely because they were nearly impossible to detect without genetic evidence, and because everyone involved had a strong incentive never to talk about it. There wasn't much practical legal recourse available to me at this point, decades after the fact, and honestly, pursuing any kind of legal action against my own parents for the adoption itself never felt like something I actually wanted to do. I was, and remain, less interested in punishing the mechanism of the lie than in understanding it. But learning that the entire system, lawyers, courts, sealed records, could be quietly, invisibly gamed by people determined enough to do it, changed how I think about every other closed adoption, no information available story I've ever heard secondhand from other adoptees. I used to assume closed records meant there was truly no information to find. Now I know that sometimes it just means someone very deliberately made sure there wouldn't be. I mentioned earlier how all of this affected my marriage, but I haven't talked about how it rippled out into Josh's side of the family too, which surprised me, honestly, since none of them were biologically connected to any of it at all. Josh's mother, Carol, took the news almost as hard as my own mother did in a strange, secondhand way. She and my mom had become genuinely close over the 8 years Josh and I had been together. Close enough that Carol described feeling almost like she was grieving a friend's marriage, alongside her own son's mother-in-law. She started calling my mom weekly, just to check in, and the two of them ended up going on a joint trip to visit family in Florida together about a year later. An entirely unplanned friendship that emerged sideways out of the wreckage of everything else. Josh's father, on the other hand, took a much more skeptical view of the whole thing, at least at first. And I remember one uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner about 4 months into all of this, where he asked, not unkindly but bluntly, whether I was sure I wanted to keep pursuing relationships with all these new people, as he put it, instead of just focusing on my own immediate family and moving forward. I understood where the question came from, a genuine concern that I was spreading myself too thin, taking on too much emotional weight during a year that already included a new baby and a family divorce. But it stung anyway, because it felt like it minimized how much I actually needed to understand what had happened to me, not just move past it as quickly as possible for everyone else's comfort. Josh, for what it's worth, defended me in that conversation more firmly than I expected, which I think was the moment I really understood how much he'd absorbed of what I was going through, even during the stretches where I worried I wasn't sharing enough of it with him directly. It's been just over 2 years now since that Thursday evening when I sat on my hallway floor with a laundry basket on my hip and read the words, parent/child, 99.9% probability, for the first time. Lily just turned 2. She's talking now, mostly in short, determined sentences, mostly demanding snacks. My relationship with Caleb has become, unexpectedly, the steadiest one to come out of all of this. We talk almost every week now, not always about anything important. He sends me pictures of his dog. I send him pictures of Lily. We argue about Ohio sports teams the same way he and Danny did at that first birthday party. Melissa remains warmer but more guarded, present in a way that feels genuine but carefully bounded, which I've stopped taking personally, because I understand now that it's simply how she's chosen to protect herself, and I respect it. Renata still checks in every few months, brief and friendly, content to stay at the edge of things rather than the center. My mother is, by every measure I can see, thriving in a way I don't think she expected to be capable of at this stage of her life. My father is stable, in therapy, present for Lily, and still, in some ways, a man I'm still learning how to have a relationship with. 2 years in, with no clear finish line in sight for that particular process. Diane and I talk every week. Some weeks it's substantial. Real conversations about her life, my life, the years we missed. Some weeks it's just a text about nothing. I've stopped needing every single conversation with her to feel monumental, which I think is actually a sign of how normal our relationship has slowly become. If you're reading this because you've just gotten a DNA match notification you weren't expecting, or because you're standing at the edge of a similar discovery in your own family, here's what I'd want you to know, for whatever it's worth coming from a stranger on the internet who's lived through it. It is going to feel, for a while, like the ground has genuinely disappeared from underneath you, and that feeling is real and valid, and you shouldn't let anyone rush you through it. Give yourself permission to be angry, to grieve a version of your history you thought was true, to ask every single question you have even if the people you're asking don't want to answer them. You are allowed to want the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient for the people who built the lie. At the same time, try to hold space for the possibility that the people who lied to you were not always acting purely out of malice. My mother's lie came from fear and a desperate, misguided attempt at love, even though it caused real harm. That doesn't excuse it, but understanding the shape of someone's fear can sometimes make it easier to eventually find your way back to a relationship with them, if that's something you want. And finally, know that whatever new relationships come out of a discovery like this, siblings, biological parents, whole new branches of family you never knew existed, you get to decide, entirely on your own terms, how close you let any of them get. There's no rulebook that says you owe deep intimacy to someone just because you share their DNA. Melissa taught me that, more than anyone else in this story. You're allowed to take it one conversation at a time, and you're allowed to stop whenever it stops feeling good for you. I want to tell you about one specific evening that I've avoided mentioning until now, because it's still the hardest one for me to write about clearly. It happened the December after everything came out, roughly a year and a half into this whole ordeal, and it's the closest thing this story has to a single, explosive confrontation scene, the kind you'd expect from a movie rather than real life. My mom decided for the first Christmas after the divorce that she wanted to host a small gathering. Just her, Danny, me, Josh, and Lily at her new, smaller house, a deliberate attempt to build a new tradition instead of grieving the old one. What none of us planned for was my father showing up uninvited, slightly drunk, around 8 o'clock that evening, standing on my mother's porch in the cold, asking to come in and see his granddaughter. My mom let him in, because whatever else was true between them, she wasn't going to leave a 61-year-old man standing in freezing weather on Christmas, and for about 20 minutes, it was almost fine. A little tense, a little strange, but manageable. He held Lily. He made a joke about the ornaments, and then, out of nowhere, he started talking about Diane. "I saw her name in your call log once when you left your phone on the counter," he said to me, his words a little slurred. I know you talk to her all the time now. Do you talk about me? What do you say about me? I remember feeling my whole body go cold, because there was something in his voice that wasn't quite the quiet remorse I'd gotten used to over the previous year. Something closer to resentment, like some part of him genuinely believed he was the one being wronged in all of this. We talk about a lot of things, Dad, I said carefully. It's not really any of your business what specifically. Everything about my life became everybody's business the second you took that test, he said, and his voice cracked. Not with sadness this time, but with something sharper. Do you have any idea what it's like, watching your own daughter build a whole new family out of the wreckage of the worst mistakes of your life? I lost my marriage, I lost my golf league, I lost people I've known for 30 years, and you all get to gain a bunch of new siblings and a whole new mother out of it. It doesn't feel fair, Rachel. I know I did wrong. I know that. But it doesn't feel fair. The room went completely silent. My mom's face had gone pale and still in a way I'd never seen before. Danny actually stood up out of his chair, like he was preparing to physically get between us if he needed to. You don't get to say that to her, my mom said, her voice shaking but clear. You do not get to stand in my house, on Christmas, and tell her that the consequences of your own choices aren't fair. You created every single person in this story, Robert. Every one. And you don't get to resent them for existing just because their existence finally caught up with you. He left about 10 minutes later, apologizing in a hollow, automatic way that didn't feel like it came from anywhere real. I didn't talk to him again for almost 6 weeks after that night. The longest stretch of silence between us since everything had started. And when we finally did speak again, it was over the phone, and he apologized again, this time in a way that felt different, quieter, less performed. I've been sitting with what I said, he told me. I was drunk, but that's not an excuse. It's just context. I think some part of me has been waiting this whole time for you to eventually blame yourself a little, the way I've been blaming myself, so that I wouldn't have to carry all of it alone. That's not fair to put on you. None of this is your fault, Rachel. I know that. I said something cruel because I wanted, for one night, for it to not all be my fault, and I took it out on the one person in this entire situation who did absolutely nothing wrong. I appreciated that he could eventually name it that clearly. It didn't erase the night itself, but it told me something real about the difference between the version of my father who lied for decades and the version who was, at least sometimes now, capable of looking directly at his own worst moments instead of flinching away from them. I started seeing a therapist about 3 months into all of this, mostly at Josh's gentle insistence, and I want to talk about that process a little, because I think it mattered more to how I eventually settled into this new version of my life than almost anything else. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Alvarez, had actually worked with a handful of other clients over the years who'd gone through similar DNA-related discoveries. Not identical, but similar enough in shape that she wasn't starting from zero, trying to understand what I was describing. One of the first things she said to me, in our second or third session, stuck with me for the rest of that year. You're not just grieving a lie, she said. You're grieving a version of yourself that existed before you knew the lie. The Rachel who had a settled, uncomplicated relationship with her own history. That version of you isn't coming back. And it's okay to actually mourn her specifically, separately from mourning anything about your parents' choices. That reframing helped me more than I expected it to. I had been so focused, for months, on processing my anger at my father, my complicated feelings toward my mother, my strange new relationships with Caleb and Melissa and Diane, that I hadn't given myself any real space to simply grieve the loss of my own former certainty, the girl who knew, without question, exactly where she came from, even if that knowledge turned out to be built on sand. Dr. Alvarez also helped me work through something I hadn't fully named until she pointed it out directly. A persistent, low-grade fear that I might somehow inherit not just my father's genetic risk factors, but his capacity for dishonesty. An irrational worry, she pointed out, since character isn't inherited the way blood pressure or eye color is, but a real and understandable fear anyway, given how directly his choices had reshaped my entire sense of what my own family was capable of hiding. "You get to choose who you become," she told me more than once, in more than one session. "Nothing about his choices obligates you to repeat any part of them. If anything, you've spent this entire year actively practicing the opposite of what he did, choosing hard truths over comfortable silence, over and over again, every single time you picked up the phone to ask another difficult question instead of letting it go." I still see Dr. Alvarez every other week, more than 2 years later, not because I'm in crisis anymore, but because I've come to genuinely value having a space where I can keep processing a story that, as I said earlier, doesn't really have a final chapter. There was one more strange, almost bureaucratic thread to this whole story that I want to mention, because it was one of the more surreal individual moments of the entire 2 years, even though it sounds small compared to everything else. At some point, out of a mix of curiosity and a strange need to hold the actual physical proof of everything in my hands, I requested a certified copy of my original adoption paperwork from the county courthouse. It arrived in a plain envelope about 3 weeks later, and I remember sitting at my kitchen table, Lily napping in the next room, reading through pages of formal legal language describing the relinquishment and adoption of a female infant, with a strange, detached feeling, like I was reading a legal document about a stranger rather than about myself. Tucked into the file was my original birth certificate. Not the amended one issued after the adoption, which lists Grace and Robert Doyle as my parents, but the very first one, filed at the hospital the day I was born. Under Mother, it listed Diane's full name. Under Father, it said, simply, Unknown. I sat with that word for a long time. Unknown. Not because it was actually unknown. My father was standing right there, 40 minutes away, at that exact moment, probably watching television in his new apartment, but because listing him honestly would have exposed the entire arrangement before it had even begun. That single word, sitting quietly in a county records office for 26 years, was maybe the most concentrated, literal piece of evidence of the whole lie. An entire, deliberate falsehood, boiled down to one word on an official government document, filed and forgotten and technically true only in the narrowest, most legally convenient sense. I don't know exactly why, but I asked my attorney whether it was possible to have that original document corrected now, to have my father's name legally entered where Unknown had sat for over 2.5 decades. She told me it was possible, though it would require a formal petition, my father's cooperation, and a judge's approval, given how unusual the underlying situation was. I asked my dad if he'd cooperate, and he said yes immediately, without a second of hesitation, which was, in its own quiet way, one of the more meaningful things he did for me during that entire 2-year stretch. The correction went through about 4 months later. I now have a legal document, filed with the state of Ohio, that finally tells the truth in the one place it had been most deliberately hidden for the longest. Near the end of the second year, once things had settled into something closer to a rhythm, Diane and I had a long conversation, one of the longest we'd had, about the actual year she'd spent pregnant with me, the year I'd only ever heard about secondhand, filtered through my parents' careful, self-protective version of events. She told me about finding out she was pregnant alone in her apartment, sitting on the edge of her bathtub, before she'd even told my father. She told me about the specific conversation where he first suggested the arrangement with Grace, and how it had taken her nearly 3 weeks to agree to it. Weeks she spent circling the decision from every possible angle, terrified of every option in front of her. She told me about the day she signed the relinquishment paperwork, how she'd asked the hospital to let her hold me for exactly 1 hour before they took me to meet Grace and Robert in a separate room down the hall. An hour she said she has replayed in her memory more times than she can count over the last 26 years. "I memorized your face in that hour," she told me, her voice thick. I know that probably sounds impossible, that a newborn's face could be memorized and recognized 26 years later, but I promise you, the day you finally sent me a photo of yourself as an adult, I knew instantly. Something in your eyes hadn't changed at all. She told me about the years afterward, the birthdays she marked privately every single year without telling anyone why a particular date made her quiet and distant. The moment she saw a teenage girl in a grocery store once who looked enough like what she imagined I might look like, that she had to leave her cart in the aisle and sit in her car for 20 minutes before she could finish shopping. She told me she'd looked up adoption reunion registries more than once over the years, always stopping herself before actually registering, afraid of disrupting whatever life I might have built, afraid of being rejected, afraid, more than anything, of learning that the choice she'd made all those years ago had been the wrong one. "I don't regret having you," she said. "I will never regret that. I regret almost everything about the year that came after having you. I regret trusting your father when he told me his marriage was over. I regret agreeing to an arrangement that erased me instead of just placing you with strangers who might have at least told you honestly, someday, that your birth mother chose adoption because she loved you and couldn't provide, instead of building an entire fictional story around a woman who was, in reality, standing right there the whole time, close enough to drive to, and legally forbidden from ever telling you so." I think about that conversation more than almost any other one from these past 2 years. It's the one that made me understand, most clearly, that Diane wasn't a distant, abstract birth mother from a bedtime story. She was a real person who had spent 26 years actively, painfully missing me, in a silence just as heavy and just as lonely as the one my mother had been keeping on the other side of it the entire time. I haven't mentioned yet how any of this played out at my actual job, and I think it's worth including because it turned out to be one of the more unexpectedly difficult parts of that first year. Not because anyone at work was unkind, but because I had to figure out, almost in real time, how much of an enormous personal upheaval to bring into a professional space where I still had to show up every day and function. I work in marketing for a regional healthcare company, a job I'd had for about 4 years by the time all of this started, and I made the decision early on to tell my direct manager, Priya, not the same Priya as Caleb's girlfriend, a coincidence that made our group texts briefly very confusing, a general, vague version of what was happening, mostly so she'd understand why I might occasionally need to step out for a call or show up looking like I hadn't slept. Word travels in offices the way it travels in small towns, and within a couple of months, most of my immediate team had picked up on the fact that something significant was happening in my personal life, even without knowing the details. What surprised me was how many people, once I did start sharing pieces of it more openly, told me they had some version of a genetic surprise story themselves, or knew someone close to them who did. A coworker named Denise told me, quietly, over lunch one day, that her own father had found out at 53 that the man he'd always known as his father wasn't biologically related to him at all. A discovery Denise's grandmother had apparently taken to her grave rather than ever explain. Another coworker mentioned an uncle who'd discovered a half-sister through a DNA test just the year before, in a story with eerily similar shape to my own, minus the sheer scale of mine. It made me realize something I probably should have already understood, given how this whole thing started. I wasn't actually as unusual a case as it felt like in the middle of it. Consumer DNA testing has quietly detonated thousands of families' foundational stories over the past decade, in living rooms and kitchen tables across the entire country, most of which never get told publicly the way I've decided to tell mine. There's an entire hidden landscape of people walking around with a version of this exact experience, sitting somewhere in their own history, most of them never talking about it outside their own immediate circle. I want to give some space to the people who married into this entire mess without any biological stake in it at all, because I think their experience of it deserves acknowledgement too, even though none of it was technically about them. Josh, obviously, I've already talked about at length. But Caleb's girlfriend Priya, Melissa's husband David, and even Frank, Diane's husband, whom I've already covered in some depth. All of them ended up absorbing an enormous amount of secondary weight from a situation that had nothing to do with their own genetics or their own choices. David, Melissa's husband, told me once, at a family gathering about a year and a half in, that the hardest part for him wasn't any single dramatic moment, but the slow, cumulative drain of watching his wife carry an entirely new emotional burden for months on end, without a clear endpoint in sight. I got married to someone who had a pretty settled relationship with her own family history, he said. And then, almost overnight, she had 4 new relatives, a decades-old betrayal to process, and a mother going through her own reckoning at the same time. I didn't sign up for that specifically, but I signed up for her, so I figured it out as we went. Priya, Caleb's girlfriend, told me something similar but from a slightly different angle. She said the strangest part for her was watching Caleb's relationship with his own sense of identity shift in real time, week by week, as new information came in. He used to describe himself, half-jokingly, as a total mama's boy who'd inherited absolutely nothing from his dad's side because he thought Mike's whole extended family was just quiet and reserved. Unlike him, she said. Finding out he actually had a completely different biological father changed how he understood some of his own personality traits, in this strange, retroactive way. It wasn't a bad thing exactly. It was just a lot to watch someone go through. I think what all of the spouses in this story have in common is a particular kind of patience that none of us, the actual siblings, the actual biological center of the story, ever had to develop in quite the same way, because we were all too consumed by our own direct grief and shock to fully appreciate, in the moment, how much weight they were quietly carrying alongside us. I want to end with something a little different. A version of a letter I actually wrote to my daughter, Lily, about a year into all of this, that I plan to give her someday when she's old enough to understand it. I've adapted it slightly here, but the core of it is exactly what I want her to eventually know. Dear Lily, by the time you're old enough to read this, you'll probably already know most of the story, about your grandpa Robert, about Diane, about your Uncle Caleb and your Aunt Melissa, about everything that happened in the year and a half after you were born. I want you to hear, directly from me, why I did what I did, and why I don't regret it, even though it cost our family a version of simplicity we can never quite get back. I ordered that first DNA test because of you. I wanted a doctor to be able to answer real questions about your health someday, instead of shrugging and saying, "We don't have that information," the way every doctor had shrugged at me my whole life. I had no idea it would uncover everything it uncovered. I want you to know that even if I had known, I think I still would have done it, because I believe, all the way down, that the truth about where we come from belongs to us, even when it's complicated, even when other people would rather we never found it. You are going to grow up with more family than most people have, More aunts and uncles and cousins, more complicated history, more difficult questions to eventually ask if you want to. I hope you see that as an abundance rather than a burden. I know it doesn't always feel that way when you're in the middle of it, but from where I'm standing now, 2 years out from the day it all started, I can tell you that every single relationship this whole ordeal gave me, messy, unearned, unexpected as they all were, has made my life fuller rather than smaller. I hope you never have to go through anything like this yourself. But if you ever do get a notification on your phone that changes everything you thought you knew about your own life, I hope you remember this letter, and I hope it helps you feel a little less alone in it than I sometimes felt in mine. Love, Mom. I mentioned Renata earlier only briefly, since she chose to stay at the edges of the group rather than fully joining in, but I asked her, near the 2-year mark, if she'd be willing to share a little more of her own perspective for anyone reading this who might be in a similar position. Someone who discovers a whole new set of siblings later in life and has to decide, without any obligation either way, how close to actually let them get. She agreed, on the condition that I not push her toward more contact than she was comfortable with, which I fully respected. Renata told me she'd grown up the only child of a single mother in Michigan who had, similarly to Patricia, never remarried and never fully explained who Renata's father was beyond a vague reference to someone from a long time ago who wasn't ready. Unlike the rest of us, Renata had actually met my father once, briefly, at 19, when her mother finally gave her his name, and she'd tracked him down out of simple curiosity during a restless summer between semesters of college. She described that meeting as brief and strange. A stilted lunch at a diner, my father visibly uncomfortable, offering nothing in the way of real answers or real remorse, before quietly suggesting they not make it a regular thing. I walked away from that lunch at 19, having basically already made peace with never having a real relationship with him, she told me. So by the time all of you found me through the DNA app, I wasn't shocked the way the rest of you seem to have been. I already knew who he was, in the sense that mattered to me. I already knew he wasn't going to be a father in any real way. Finding out there were 3 more of you out there just confirmed something I'd already quietly suspected about the kind of person he must have been his whole life. I asked her why she'd chosen to stay distant from the rest of us, even though she seemed to genuinely like Caleb and me whenever we did talk. "It's not about you," she said. "None of you did anything to me. It's just, I built an entire adult life without needing this family. I raised my own kids without it. I don't think reopening it all the way the rest of you have with each other, would actually add anything good to my life at this point. I like hearing how you're all doing. I like that Lily exists and that she's happy, but I don't need a group chat and a yearly reunion to feel connected to that. I think there's room in a story like this for people who want the whole thing, and people who just want to know it exists and check in occasionally, and I don't think either choice is the wrong one." I've thought about that distinction a lot since she said it. The difference between wanting the whole thing and wanting to simply know it exists. I think, in the 2 years since all of this started, I've watched every single person touched by this story land somewhere different on that particular spectrum, and I've come to believe there really isn't a correct place to land. There's only the place that actually lets you keep living your life without the discovery consuming more of you than you're willing to give it. There's one question I still get asked more than any other, usually toward the end of conversations when people have finally absorbed the full scope of everything I've laid out here, and it's the one I still find hardest to answer honestly, even 2 years and dozens of retellings later. People ask, knowing everything you know now, if you could go back to that Tuesday afternoon at the post office, kid in hand, about to mail it off, would you still do it? For a long time, my automatic answer was an immediate, uncomplicated yes, because I believed, and still mostly believe, that truth is better than comfortable ignorance, almost as a matter of principle. But I've gotten more honest with myself about the actual weight of that answer the longer I've sat with it. Yes, I would still do it. But I no longer pretend that means the cost of doing it was small, or that everyone who paid part of that cost, my mother, losing 31 years of a marriage she believed in even while suspecting parts of it were rotten. Frank, discovering the full shape of a story he'd only ever known in outline. Mike, learning at 50-something that a fact he'd never once questioned about his own life wasn't true. Patricia, having 30-year-old wounds reopened with no warning at all, would necessarily choose the same answer if the decision had been theirs to make, instead of mine. I ordered that test for myself and for Lily. I didn't ask anyone else's permission because I didn't know, and couldn't have known, how far the consequences would actually travel. I think that's the part of this story I'm still the most unsettled by. Honestly, not the affair, not the lie, not even my father's decades of quiet denial, but the fact that a single private decision I made for entirely personal reasons ended up reshaping the lives of at least a dozen people who never got any say in whether they wanted that reshaping to happen to them. I don't think that makes what I did wrong. I've turned it over from every angle I can think of, and I keep landing in the same place. The truth was always going to surface eventually, one way or another, because it existed independently of whether I went looking for it, sitting quietly in strands of DNA that were never going to stop being real, just because nobody had the tools to read them yet. I just happened to be the one who finally had access to the tools. But I've stopped pretending that gives me a clean, uncomplicated moral high ground over everyone else in this story who made a different choice, in a different decade, with different tools available to them. We were all, in our own ways, just people trying to figure out how much of the truth we could survive knowing, and how much of it we could survive telling. There's one last piece of this story I want to include, because it's been sitting with me for a long time and I don't think it fits neatly anywhere else. My father's parents, my biological grandparents, on the side that turned out to be more complicated than I ever knew, passed away before any of this came out. My grandfather when I was 19 and my grandmother when I was 23, both of them believing, as far as anyone can tell, the same story I believed my entire life. That I was a beloved adopted granddaughter with no biological connection to their son at all. I think about my grandmother especially, because she was, by every account, one of the warmest people in my entire extended family, the kind of grandmother who kept a drawer of quarters just for me to play the gumball machine at the grocery store, who called me her little surprise blessing, without ever knowing how literally true that phrase actually was. Great Aunt Pat told me, in that same phone call where she admitted her old suspicions, that she'd always privately wondered whether my grandmother knew more than she let on. That same instinct Pat herself had, about my resemblance to the family, about the too smooth adoption story. But that if she did know, or suspect, she went to her grave never once letting on to anyone, including her own son. I'll never get to ask her directly. I'll never get to know whether she looked at photographs of me as a baby and quietly recognized her own bloodline staring back, the way Pat eventually told me she had. I'll never get to know whether some part of her chose the same kind of protective silence that seems to run through nearly every branch of this story, generation after generation, or whether she genuinely, completely believed the story the rest of us were told. What I do know is that she loved me without reservation for 23 years, fully, unconditionally, in exactly the way a grandmother is supposed to love a grandchild, regardless of what she did or didn't know about the biology underneath it, And I think that's actually the truest, simplest lesson buried inside this entire sprawling, complicated mess of a story. Love and truth are not always the same transaction. Sometimes people love you completely and still keep things from you. Sometimes people keep things from you specifically because they love you, even when that choice ends up causing harm they never intended. My grandmother's love for me was real whether or not she knew the whole truth. The same way my mother's love for me was real, even inside 26 years of a story that wasn't. Untangling which parts of a family's love are genuine and which parts are performance built to protect a lie turns out to be one of the hardest, longest projects a person can take on, and I don't think I've fully finished it yet, even now, even after everything. If you strip away all the individual dramatic beats of this story, the confrontation in my parents' kitchen, the group text with 3 strangers who shared my father's DNA, the Christmas Eve blow-up, the birth certificate with unknown typed where a real name should have been, I think what's actually left underneath all of it is a much simpler, much smaller question that every single person in this story had to answer for themselves, over and over, in their own way, across 4 decades. When you're standing at the edge of a truth that will cost you something, do you tell it? Or do you protect yourself and the people around you by staying quiet? My father chose silence, almost every single time, for almost 40 years, and I don't think he ever once seriously weighed the cumulative cost of choosing that same answer again and again until it finally caught up with him all at once. Decades worth of quiet decisions arriving on his doorstep in a single devastating year. My mother chose silence too, for 26 years, but she chose it, I've come to believe, out of something closer to fear and love tangled together than out of the same self-interested calculation my father seemed to make every time. Diane chose silence because she believed, rightly or wrongly, that it was the only way to protect a life she hadn't yet had the chance to build. Sharon chose it to protect a marriage she genuinely loved. Patricia, in her own way, chose it too, though hers came wrapped in something closer to exhaustion and self-protection after being denied and threatened into it in the first place. And I chose the opposite. I chose to ask the questions, to open the app, to read the message, to write the letter, to make the call, over and over at every single fork in this story, where I could have quietly closed the laptop and let a piece of the truth stay buried instead. I don't say that to hold myself up as some kind of moral example, because I understand now, more than I did at the start of all of this, that choosing truth is a much easier, cleaner choice to make when you're the one asking the questions rather than the one who has to answer them. It's a very different kind of courage to go looking for a hard truth than it is to be the person who finally has to tell one. Standing in your own kitchen, watching your daughter's face change in front of you as an entire life you built for her collapses and gets rebuilt in real time. I think, in the end, that's the real reason I wanted to write this whole thing out as fully as I have, instead of just giving you the short, dramatic version, the DNA match, the affair, the divorce, the reunion, done. Because the short version makes it sound like a story about betrayal and revelation, something that happens to you and then resolves. The long version, the one I've actually lived, is a story about what happens after the revelation, in all the slow, unglamorous months and years where actual people have to figure out how to keep loving each other, or stop, or something complicated in between, once the lie they built their relationships around has been fully, permanently removed. That part doesn't make for a dramatic 3-minute video, but it's the part that actually mattered, and it's the part I hope stays with you longer than the shock of the reveal itself. Before I get to the very end of this, I want to say something directly to anyone reading this who's currently sitting exactly where I sat that Thursday night. Kit already mailed off? Results pending? That strange mix of curiosity and dread waiting in the pit of your stomach every time your phone buzzes with a notification that might, this time, be the one. You cannot control what's waiting on the other side of that test. You can't prepare for every possible outcome, no matter how many worst-case scenarios you run through in your head at 2 in the morning, because the actual shape of a genetic surprise almost never matches the shape you imagined it would take. I spent the weeks before my results came in bracing myself for something small and manageable, maybe a slightly different ethnicity breakdown than expected, maybe a distant cousin with an interesting story. I never once braced myself for a parent-child match, because it genuinely never occurred to me as a real possibility. I think most people in this exact position feel some version of that same false confidence, the quiet certainty that whatever they find is going to be manageable, because the alternative feels too big to actually imagine in advance. What I can tell you from the other side of it is that whatever you find, you will find a way to carry it, even on the days it feels genuinely impossible. I did not think, in October 2 years ago, sitting on that hallway floor with a laundry basket on my hip, that I would ever feel steady again. I do now. Not because the facts changed back to something simpler. They never will. But because I slowly, unevenly, built an entirely new kind of steadiness around the facts as they actually are, instead of the facts I wish they'd turned out to be. That process took most of 2 years, and honestly, I don't think it's fully finished even now. But it's real, and it's sturdier than I expected. And if you're standing at the beginning of your own version of this, I want you to know that whatever waits for you on the other side of that notification, there is, eventually, a version of steady waiting for you too, even if you can't picture it yet from where you're standing. It's a Tuesday afternoon as I finish writing this, and Lily is asleep in the next room, and Josh is at work, and my phone is sitting quietly on the table next to me, not buzzing with anything urgent for the first time in what feels like a very long stretch. I wanted to end on this specific ordinary moment rather than any of the dramatic ones, because I think it's the truest picture of where all of this actually leads, eventually. If you keep walking through it long enough, there's no dramatic music playing under this part of my life. There's no cliffhanger. There's just a Tuesday, and a sleeping toddler, and a mother I talk to more honestly now than I ever did before any of this started, and a father I'm still cautiously, imperfectly learning how to have in my life, and a handful of siblings scattered across 2 states who I never expected to exist, and now can't imagine my life without. At least most of them. Most of the time. There's a biological mother 2 hours away who knows my daughter's name and sends her a card every single birthday now, without fail, making up, in her own small way, for 26 birthdays she never got to acknowledge at all. I used to think the goal of a story like this was resolution, some final scene where everyone forgives everyone, or everyone cuts everyone off cleanly, some neat ending that tells you exactly how to feel about the whole thing. I don't think that's actually how any of this works, not in real life. What you get instead, if you're lucky, is something quieter and more durable than resolution. An ordinary Tuesday, 2 years later, where the truth that once felt like it was going to destroy everything has simply become part of the furniture of your life. Heavy in places, but livable. The same way any hard, true thing eventually becomes livable, once you've carried it long enough to learn its actual weight, instead of just fearing it from a distance. Before I get to the very end, there's a small detail I want to include, because it surprised me with how much it mattered once it actually happened. Somewhere in the second year of all of this, almost as an afterthought during a phone call about something else entirely, Diane asked me a question she'd apparently been sitting on for months, afraid to bring it up directly. "Do you know if I was ever allowed to name you anything before they took you?" she asked. I've always wondered if I got a say in that, even for an hour. I hadn't known the answer myself until I checked the original hospital paperwork, the same file with unknown typed under father. It turned out Diane had, in fact, listed a name on the temporary birth record before the adoption was finalized, and my legal name was changed to Rachel, a name she'd apparently picked out for me during that single hour she got to hold me, the hour she'd told me about. The one she said she'd replayed in her memory more times than she could count. The name she'd chosen was Emma. I sat with that for a long time after I found it. This small, quiet, almost unbearably tender detail buried in a folder of formal legal language. A name a young, frightened, heartbroken woman had chosen, in a single hour, for a daughter she believed she'd never get to raise. A name that got legally erased and replaced within days, and that nobody had spoken out loud in 26 years, until I finally found it typed on a form nobody was ever supposed to show me. I told Diane I'd found it, and she cried on the phone for a long time, and then she asked if it would be strange if she just called me that. Sometimes, privately, between the two of us, not to replace Rachel, just to have something that was hers, something nobody else had ever gotten to use. I told her it wouldn't be strange at all. Now, every so often, usually at the end of a call, she'll say quietly, "Good night, Emma," and I've come to genuinely love hearing it. Not because it's who I am now, but because it's a small, specific piece of who I almost was, in another version of this story, one where she'd been allowed to keep me and raise me herself. It's the one part of this entire 2-year unraveling that feels less like an excavation of something painful and more like a small private gift, quietly restored to both of us at the exact same time. I think about that little white box that showed up on my doorstep 2 years ago more than almost anything else in my life now. At the time, it felt like the most boring procedural task in the world. Spit in a tube, mail it off, forget about it. I had no idea it was going to be the single most consequential thing I ever did. More consequential than my wedding, more consequential, in some strange way, than almost anything except the birth of my own daughter. I don't know how to wrap this up neatly, because it isn't over. Not really. Somewhere out there, potentially, is a fifth sibling who hasn't tested yet, or hasn't followed up on a low-confidence match sitting quietly in their account the way Melissa's sat for 3 years. Somewhere out there is the rest of my father's history. Pieces of it he may not even fully remember himself at this point. I've stopped waiting for a final chapter, because I think the honest truth is that stories like this one don't really get final chapters. They just get quieter over time as the people in them slowly learn how to live inside the new, more complicated version of the truth instead of the simpler, false one they grew up believing. What I can tell you, with complete certainty, is this: I am glad I know. Every hard conversation, every sleepless night, every moment of watching my parents' marriage come apart, every awkward first phone call with a stranger who turned out to share half my DNA, all of it was worth it. Because now, for the first time in my entire life, I actually know who I am, where I came from, and who I'm connected to. That knowledge came at an enormous cost to a lot of people, including me. But it's mine now. Finally. Fully. And nobody gets to take it back or rewrite it into a bedtime story ever again. Thank you for reading this far. If you've been through something even remotely similar, I hope you know you're not as alone in it as it probably feels. I still keep that original little white box, empty now, flattened in a drawer in my office of all things. It seems like a strange object to hold on to. Cardboard, appealing logo, nothing special to look at. But every so often, when I'm cleaning out that drawer and find it again, I take a second to actually hold it, and I think about the version of me who dropped it in a mailbox on her lunch break without a second thought, completely unaware of everything it was about to set in motion. I don't think that version of me was naive exactly. I just think she didn't yet know what she was capable of surviving, and I like being able to look at that small, ordinary box every once in a while and remember, clearly, exactly how far I actually made it.